The strongest tornado on Earth right now is not out at sea. It just tore through American soil. In Enid, Oklahoma, a wedge of black wind hit the ground at 175 miles per hour, ripped 40 homes apart, and shut down a US Air Force base. That was day 1. 6 days later, the outbreak is still alive, Texas towns flattened, 2 dead, hail the size of baseballs, and another night of warnings ahead. If this kind of weather grips you the way it grips us, like and subscribe before we go further. Because what's driving this is bigger than one storm. Stay with me. A woman in Enid, Oklahoma climbed into an 8x8 concrete cellar with her husband, her brother-in-law, and a neighbour. Then she heard the door start to scream. Metal slapped against the hatch. Glass shattered above their heads. A roaring sound rolled over the cellar like a freight train, passing inches from their faces. When they finally crawled out, the windows of their brick home were gone. The roof was peeled back. The neighbourhood was unrecognisable. This was the night of April 23rd, 2026. The town of Enid sits about 85 miles north of Oklahoma City. Around 50,000 people live there. Most of them had been watching the sky all afternoon. The Storm Prediction Center had warned for 2 full days that something violent was likely. By dinner time, the air outside felt wrong. Heavy. Warm. Charged. At 8:11 at night, a thunderstorm just southwest of Vance Air Force Base began to spin harder than the storms around it. Within minutes, a funnel touched down. It was wide, it was slow, and it was already throwing debris in every direction. The National Weather Service in Norman did something they almost never do. They issued a tornado emergency. That phrase is the most serious warning in the entire American weather system. It is only used when a confirmed violent tornado is about to hit a populated place. For a town the size of Enid, that warning meant one thing: get underground now. Storm chasers parked outside the city watched it form into what meteorologists call a stovepipe, a thick, dark column that holds its shape for minutes at a time. One chaser later said it stayed almost stationary for a long stretch, grinding the ground in place. A long-time resident who had lived in Oklahoma since 1971 told reporters it sounded like a locomotive coming through his living room. He had seen tornadoes his whole life. He said this was the largest one he had ever watched. The tornado stayed on the ground for 37 minutes. It carved a path 9.5 miles long. At its widest point, the wind field stretched 500 yards across. That is roughly 5 football fields lined end to end. It crossed neighbourhoods, it crossed farmland, it clipped the edge of the Air Force Base. It rolled vehicles, snapped wooden power poles at their bases, and lifted heavy machinery into the air like loose paper. When dawn broke on Friday, April 24th, the scale of what had happened became clear. About 40 homes were damaged or destroyed. Some were stripped to their foundations. A father and son combed through what was left of a small woodworking shop, pulling splintered beams out of a pile that used to be their walls. Volunteers from Kansas had already driven in to help dig. 10 people were injured. None of them died. Officials called that fact a small miracle. The governor of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, signed a state of emergency for 2 counties before the next storm cycle began. Here is what was strange. The Enid tornado was not the worst of what was coming. It was the opening act. Because the same atmospheric setup that produced this single wedge over Oklahoma was about to lock itself in place over the central United States and refuse to leave for 6 straight days. The next chapter explains exactly what made that opening strike so violent in the first place, and what those numbers really mean for the houses that stood in its path. The number that mattered most that night was 175, as in 175 miles per hour. That is the wind speed the National Weather Service estimated for the Enid tornado at its peak. To put that into something a listener can feel, imagine driving down a freeway at 70 miles per hour and sticking your hand out the window. Now multiply that pressure by 6. That is what the walls of those homes were facing. The enhanced Fujita scale is how American meteorologists rate tornadoes after the fact. It runs from F0 to F5. F0 is light damage. Branches snap. F5 is total destruction. Well-built homes are wiped clean off their foundations. Enid was rated F4. That is the second highest category that exists. It puts the storm in the same class as the most destructive tornadoes in American history. Here is the part most people do not know. The enhanced Fujita scale does not actually measure wind speed in real time. There is no instrument inside a tornado collecting data. Instead, survey teams walk the damage path on foot the next day. They look at what was destroyed and how. A snapped tree tells one story. A levelled brick home tells another. A swept-away pole barn tells a much more violent one. From those clues, scientists work backward to estimate the wind. In Enid, the clues were unmistakable. Roof systems were not just damaged. They were removed. Commercial buildings did not just lose their facades. They were flattened. A well-built pole barn near South 16th Street was swept away entirely. 2 recreational vehicles were tossed across a field. One of them was never found. Trees were not only uprooted, they were debarked. That word matters. Debarking only happens at the highest wind speeds, when flying dirt and grit strip the bark off a trunk like sandpaper. That detail alone tells survey teams they are looking at F4 damage. It cannot be faked. It cannot be caused by lower winds. It only happens when the air around a tree turns into a sandblaster. For a wood frame house, the math is brutal. Most American homes are designed to handle straight-line wind gusts up to around 90 miles per hour. Above 110, walls start failing. Above 140, the structure can be lifted off its anchor bolts. At 175 miles per hour, the house is no longer a house. It becomes a pile of building materials moving sideways across a field. There is another factor that makes F4 damage so severe: pressure. A tornado does not just push, it pulls. The pressure inside the funnel drops sharply. Roofs do not blow off, they get sucked off. Walls do not collapse inward, they explode outward. That is why survey teams in Enid found debris lines extending hundreds of yards downwind of where homes used to stand. Here is the historical weight of this rating. The Enid storm was the first F4 tornado anywhere in the United States in 2026. It was the first F4 to hit Garfield County, Oklahoma, since April 1991. That is a 35-year gap. A generation. Many of the people in those damaged homes had never seen a tornado of this magnitude in their lifetime. But the most chilling fact about the rating is what it implied for the next phase. If a single storm could reach F4 on the opening day of an outbreak, the atmosphere itself was clearly capable of producing more. And it did. Forecasters knew exactly what was loaded in the air above the plains. They had been tracking it for 48 hours. The next chapter is about the warning they issued, a phrase so rare that when it appears, it almost always means lives are about to be on the line. The phrase came across the radio at 8:22 at night. Tornado emergency for Southeast Enid. Most Americans have never heard those exact words used about their own town. Most never will. Because the tornado emergency is the rarest and most serious warning issued by the National Weather Service. It sits at the very top of a 3-level system. The first level is a tornado watch. That means conditions are favourable for tornadoes to form. The second is a tornado warning. That means a tornado has been spotted or detected on radar, and people in the path need to take shelter immediately. The third is the tornado emergency. That means a confirmed, large and destructive tornado is moving directly toward a populated area, and severe damage and loss of life are likely. It is not a routine tool. It is reserved for the worst nights of the year. The phrase was created in 1999 after a massive F5 tornado approached the Oklahoma City suburbs. Forecasters realized that a regular warning was not strong enough to communicate the danger. They needed language that would shake people out of denial, something that would make a parent grab a child mid-sentence, something that would make a driver pull over and run for a ditch. That is what a tornado emergency does. It tells the public that the worst-case version of the storm is no longer a possibility. It is happening. In Enid, the conditions for that phrase were already there. A confirmed wedge tornado was on the ground. It was tracking northeast at roughly 40 miles per hour. It was about to enter a residential neighbourhood. And the radar signature meant the storm was strengthening, not weakening. Listeners need to understand what radar sees in moments like this. Doppler weather radar measures the motion of raindrops and debris inside a storm. When forecasters see two strong opposite winds rotating side by side at low altitude, they call it a couplet. When that couplet tightens and intensifies, it means the funnel is contracting and accelerating. It is the visual equivalent of watching a figure skater pull her arms in and spin faster. Above Enid that night, the couplet was not just tight, it was screaming. Velocity readings were among the strongest the Norman radar office had seen in years. Combined with debris signatures lifting hundreds of feet into the air, the call was obvious. Tornado emergency. Once that warning is issued, the entire emergency response system reorganizes itself within minutes. Sirens activate. Cell broadcast alerts hit every phone within range. Hospitals shift staff. Fire departments stage trucks at the edge of the expected damage path. In Enid, Mayor David Mason later said that within 20 minutes of the strike, 9 ambulances were already on scene. He said it as though he could still not quite believe it. Here is the part that defines this kind of warning. The tornado emergency does not exist to inform people. It exists to save them. Every minute of advance notice, every confirmed sighting, every word added to a forecaster's voice when they speak on air is calibrated to push someone off a couch and into a basement. It is communication weaponized for survival. That is why the Enid death toll was 0. Not luck. Not coincidence, a combination of timely warnings, citizens who took the warning seriously, and underground shelters that held when everything above them failed. But the warning system has a limit. It can tell you a storm is coming. It cannot move the buildings out of its way. And one of the buildings in the path that night was not a home or a school. It was a fully active United States military airbase. The next chapter is about what happened when an F-4 crossed the runway. A weather station on Vance Air Force Base recorded a wind gust of 107 miles per hour at the moment the tornado swept past. That single number tells you everything about how close the funnel came to the runway, because that gust was not the tornado itself, that was the outer edge. Vance Air Force Base sits just south of Enid. It is a pilot training installation. On any given week, military students fly hundreds of hours in jets like the T-6 Texan and the T-38 Talon. The base houses aircraft hangars, taxiway lighting systems, fuel storage, control towers, and family housing for service members. It is, in every sense, a small city designed around the act of flying. When the tornado emergency was issued, the base went into lockdown, personnel sheltered in reinforced facilities. Aircraft were either secured in hangars or parked in protected positions. In the chaos of an F-4, none of that is a guarantee. A wedge tornado can lift a small plane like a child kicks a paper cup. Storm chasers caught dramatic footage of the funnel moving past the southern edge of the installation. The tornado at that moment was wrapped in a debris cloud so thick that the funnel itself was hard to see. Mark Fox, the meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service office in Norman, later pointed to a photograph where the tornado had a visible V-shaped fan of debris extending out from either side of the base. He said that V is one of the surest signs of a violent tornado. It only forms when winds are strong enough to throw entire pieces of building sideways at the speed of a moving car. When the all-clear came, base leadership began assessments. The damage report was, by any honest measure, a near miss. Taxiway lights were destroyed, fences were knocked flat, some equipment was damaged. The southern perimeter looked, in the words of Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt, like the storm had grazed the bottom edge of the airport. Family housing on the base was untouched. No service members were injured. No aircraft were lost. Officials announced that all assigned personnel were accounted for within hours. But the base could not simply reopen the next morning. Air Force commanders ordered the entire facility closed until further notice. Power had to be restored, water had to be checked, and every aircraft on the field had to be re-inspected before being declared safe to fly, because a tornado does not need to hit a jet directly to compromise it. Flying debris can dent a wing skin, pressure changes can damage avionics, even a hangar door bent slightly out of shape can trap a plane inside. For one of the most active pilot training pipelines in the United States Air Force, that meant a temporary halt to flight operations. Training schedules disrupted. Flight checks paused, all because a single rotating column of air decided to track 300 yards farther south than it could have. Here is the larger meaning of what happened on that runway. A tornado does not respect maps. It does not respect hardened structures. It does not respect military preparation. The same storm that flattened a civilian neighbourhood a few miles north came within minutes of striking a critical national defence facility. That is the part the public rarely sees in the days after a disaster. It is also a reminder of what these storms actually are at full strength. They are not weather events you survive by closing the curtains. They are kinetic forces capable of shutting down infrastructure that the country depends on every single day. And the visual that haunted forecasters from that night was not the radar return. It was the shape of the funnel itself. A perfect, ground-pinned, narrow column. The next chapter is about why that exact shape is the one storm chasers fear the most. The funnel did not look the way most people picture a tornado. It was not a thin rope wiggling across a field. It was a thick, dark column standing straight up, almost still, like a smokestack rooted in the dirt. Storm chasers have a name for that shape. They call it a stovepipe. A stovepipe tornado is one of the most dangerous shapes a tornado can take. The reason is simple. Shape reveals strength. To understand why, listeners need a quick mental picture of how a tornado is structured. At the top, the funnel connects to a rotating area inside the parent thunderstorm. At the bottom, it connects to the ground through a layer of swirling debris and dust. In between, the column of spinning air can stretch, narrow, widen or tilt, depending on how strong the storm's rotation is and how stable the funnel's connection is to the cloud above. When the rotation is weak, the funnel often appears as a thin rope, twisting and dancing across the landscape. These are sometimes called rope tornadoes. They are usually short-lived and produce lower wind speeds. When the rotation is moderate, the funnel takes on a cone shape, wider at the top, narrowing toward the ground. Most tornadoes look like this. They can still be destructive, but they often weaken quickly. When the rotation is intense and steady, the funnel widens into a stovepipe, roughly equal width from cloud base to ground. No taper, no wobble, just a column of compressed, screaming air locked in place, and when the rotation reaches truly extreme levels, the funnel can swell even further into what storm chasers call a wedge, wider at the base than it is tall, so broad that observers sometimes mistake it for a low cloud or a wall of rain. The Enid tornado, at 500 yards across at its widest, was firmly in wedge territory by the end of its life. But it began as a stovepipe, and that opening shape mattered. A stovepipe means the parent storm has reached a kind of dynamic equilibrium. The updraft is feeding the rotation perfectly. The downdraft is wrapping just right. The pressure gradient is balanced enough to keep the column stable for long stretches. In that state, the tornado does not race or wobble, it grinds. It plants itself in one piece of ground and processes everything inside its path. That is exactly what witnesses near Enid described. A Fox weather meteorologist on scene that night said the funnel was fairly stationary for a good long stretch, almost as if it had decided to stay. Storm chasers know this is the worst possible scenario for anyone living in the line of advance. A tornado that lingers does not just damage a structure, it dismantles it. There is another reason stovepipes are feared. They tend to produce the strongest wind speeds. The narrow, vertical shape means winds at the surface are concentrated into a tight band. A wider, more disorganized funnel spreads its energy over a larger area. A stovepipe focuses it. That is why so many of the highest-rated tornadoes in American history began as stovepipes before bulking up into wedges at peak intensity. The Enid funnel followed that exact evolution. It was a stovepipe when it crossed the perimeter of Vance Air Force Base. It was a wedge when it flattened the Grey Ridge neighborhood minutes later. So when you hear that a storm chaser took one look at a developing funnel and called it a stovepipe, you are hearing a very specific warning. You are hearing someone say, this one is not going to weaken on its own. This one has the architecture of a violent tornado. What no one in Enid knew yet was that the very atmospheric setup that produced this single perfect stovepipe was about to do it again. And again. And again. Across multiple states. The next chapter is about why this April was supposed to be calmer than it turned out to be. Months before April even began, the seasonal forecasters had a quiet message. This spring, they said, was likely to be calmer than the last two. Not safe, not silent, just less explosive than 2024 and 2025 had been. That message did not survive April. To understand why, listeners need to know how seasonal severe weather forecasts actually work. Meteorologists do not predict individual storms months in advance. What they do is study large-scale climate patterns and find years in the past that looked similar. These are called analog years. If the ocean temperatures, the jet stream position, and the air pressure patterns over the Pacific look like they did in, say, 2001, forecasters assume the upcoming season may behave in similar ways. For 2026, the climate signals pointed toward a transitioning La Niña pattern. La Niña is a cooler than average water condition in the central Pacific Ocean. It tends to push the jet stream into configurations that favour severe weather in the southern plains earlier in the spring, with a possible quiet down by May. The forecast from one prominent analysis service called it a front-loaded season, meaning get ready early, because the worst might be done by late spring. Their analogue years included 1976, 1985, 2001, 2009, and 2023. In those springs, March and early April ran above average, then activity fell off. The forecast was reasonable. It was based on real data, and in some ways it was correct. March of 2026 was already running well above average. By mid-April, there had been multiple major outbreaks, including a significant one on April 13th and 14th, and a much larger one on April 17th and 18th that produced 80 confirmed tornadoes from Oklahoma all the way to Michigan. But then, April 23rd arrived, and the forecast that said April should be the cooling off point became, quietly, the forecast that did not survive. By the morning of April 24th, the United States had logged 451 confirmed tornadoes for the year. That was already an extremely active pace. Of those, 44 had occurred in Oklahoma alone. 17 of them had touched down in April, and the Enid storm was the only one of those that reached F4 strength. Then the outbreak refused to end. Day after day, a stalled weather system sat over the central United States and kept pumping new storms. April 25th brought another moderate risk for Oklahoma and Texas. April 26th brought a high-end F2 that obliterated parts of Runaway Bay, Texas, and killed 2 people. April 27th produced more than 200 reports of damaging wind and large hail across Missouri, Arkansas, Indiana, and Illinois. April 28th brought a deadly tornado strike on Mineral Wells, Texas, the 6th straight day of severe weather. In other words, the season did not front-load, it compounded. There is an important lesson in this for anyone who follows weather forecasts. Seasonal outlooks describe likelihoods, not guarantees. They describe what the atmosphere tends to do under certain patterns. They cannot predict the timing or violence of any single outbreak. A quiet pattern can still produce one historic event, and an active pattern can still produce a quiet week. The atmosphere remains, at its core, a chaotic system. What April 2026 is now showing meteorologists is that even when the seasonal odds suggest a calmer back half of spring, the right ingredients in the right place can override those odds completely. A single stalled trough, a single dry line, a single warm front meeting a cold front at the wrong time. That is all it takes, and the ingredient that did the heaviest lifting in this outbreak was something most Americans have never heard of. A line you cannot see, drawn across the southern plains, that quietly sets the stage for some of the most violent storms on the planet. The next chapter explains exactly what it is. There is a line that runs across the plains every spring that almost no one outside of meteorology has ever heard of. It is invisible. It moves with the wind. And on certain afternoons it is the single most dangerous boundary in the entire country. It is called the dry line. The dry line is a sharp boundary between two very different bodies of air. On the east side, warm and humid air streams up from the Gulf of Mexico. It is rich in moisture. It feels heavy. It is loaded with the energy that powers thunderstorms. On the west side, hot and dry air flows down off the high deserts of the American Southwest. It is parched. It is unstable. It is light enough to rise rapidly when given a push. When those two air masses meet, the boundary between them is razor sharp. A driver crossing the dry line in a single mile can watch the dew point on a weather app drop by 20 degrees. The air smells different. It feels different. And if conditions above are right, this is the launch pad where the worst supercells of the year ignite. Here is the mechanism. Throughout a spring afternoon, the dry line drifts eastward as the dry air heats up and pushes against the moist air. Along the boundary, the moist air gets shoved upward. If the atmosphere above is unstable enough, that rising parcel of warm, wet air keeps climbing. It cools. It condenses. It builds a thunderstorm cloud that towers tens of thousands of feet into the sky. Now add wind shear. That is when winds blow in different directions at different altitudes. Surface winds might come from the southeast. Winds higher up might come from the southwest. The thunderstorm gets tilted as it grows. And in that tilted state, it begins to rotate. That is the moment a regular thunderstorm becomes a supercell. On April 23, 2026, the dry line was sitting almost exactly where forecasters had warned it would be, just east of a line cutting across northern Oklahoma. The Storm Prediction Center had outlined an enhanced risk zone covering eastern Kansas and northern Oklahoma. Strong tornadoes, the forecast read, were possible along the dry line. That single sentence was the prediction that came true. The Wikipedia entry for the outbreak described the setup in plain terms. A strongly unstable air mass was in place across northern Oklahoma. Rich, low-level moisture. Steep lapse rates, which is a way of saying temperatures dropped rapidly with height, allowing air to rise easily. Strong vertical wind shear. A capping inversion that initially held everything down, like a lid on a pressure cooker. That cap is the part that matters most. A capping inversion is a thin layer of warmer air a few thousand feet up that prevents thunderstorms from forming in the morning. It is the atmosphere's safety lock. As long as the cap holds, nothing happens. The dry line can stew all day, the Gulf moisture can pile up, the dry air can keep pushing, but by late afternoon, the surface heats enough to break the cap, and when it breaks, it does not break gently. The pent-up moisture and instability that have been building all day explode upward. Storms do not appear gradually. They erupt. That is exactly what happened on April 23rd. Discrete supercells, meaning storms that form alone rather than in a line, fired up across northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas in the late afternoon. Several of them began to rotate within minutes of forming. One of them tracked east across Garfield County. That storm produced the Enid wedge. Here is the larger meaning of the dry line. It is not a feature of weather that needs a hurricane or a polar storm to do its work. It is a feature of geography. As long as the Gulf of Mexico keeps pumping moisture north and the southwest keeps generating dry air, the dry line will exist every spring, and on the right day, with the right cap break and the right wind shear, it will produce monsters. But the dry line alone does not turn a thunderstorm into a tornado factory. There is one more invisible ingredient that has to be stacked on top of it, and it is the reason the storm above Enid did not just rain. It rotated. The next chapter explains how the atmosphere quietly winds itself up like a coiled spring before any tornado ever touches the ground. Imagine holding a deck of playing cards flat between your hands. Now slide your top hand forward and your bottom hand backward. The cards in the middle start to tilt. The top of the deck moves one way, the bottom moves the other. That is wind shear, scaled up to the size of an atmosphere. Wind shear is the difference in wind speed and direction at different altitudes. It is invisible. It is silent. It is also the single ingredient that turns a routine thunderstorm into a rotating supercell. In a stable, calm atmosphere, winds at the surface and winds high above the ground tend to flow in roughly the same direction at roughly the same speed. Storms that form in that kind of air are usually short-lived. They rain, they thunder, they die. In a sheared atmosphere, the winds change with height. Surface winds might blow gently from the southeast at 15 miles per hour. 5,000 feet up, the winds might shift to the south at 30. At 18,000 feet, they might come howling out of the southwest at 80. The total vertical change creates an enormous twisting force on any storm trying to grow up through those layers. Atmospheric scientists at Penn State and other research institutions have studied this for decades. According to Paul Markowski's research group, a difference of roughly 50 miles per hour between surface winds and winds at 18,000 feet is typically enough to create supercells. That is the threshold. Below it, storms rarely organize into anything dangerous. Above it, the door opens. Here is the mechanism that transforms shear into rotation. When winds change with height, they create what meteorologists call horizontal vorticity. Imagine an invisible barrel of air spinning sideways near the ground, like a giant rolling pin lying flat. The spin is real. The barrel is real. But it is parallel to the ground, so it produces no tornado on its own. What it needs is lift. And that is where the thunderstorm's updraft comes in. A strong updraft is a column of warm, rising air at the heart of a developing storm. When that updraft passes over a region of horizontal vorticity, it grabs the spinning barrel of air and tilts it upward. The horizontal spin becomes a vertical spin. The barrel that was lying flat is now standing on end, rotating around a vertical axis. That rotating column inside the storm is called a mesocyclone. And it is the parent of every strong tornado in American history. On April 23rd, the wind shear over northern Oklahoma was almost textbook. Surface winds were southeast, pulling Gulf moisture north. Winds aloft were southwest, racing across the upper atmosphere. The difference between the two was substantial. Forecasters watching the soundings, which are vertical profiles of the atmosphere taken by weather balloons, knew exactly what they were looking at. A loaded gun. There is a second piece of shear that matters even more. Researchers call it streamwise vorticity. In plain language, it is when the spin of the air is aligned with the direction the air is travelling. Air parcels moving toward the storm spin like spiralling footballs as they approach. When those spiralling parcels enter the updraft, the rotation transfers cleanly. The mesocyclone forms faster, tighter, and more organised. On the evening of April 23rd, the lowest layer of the atmosphere over Oklahoma was rich in exactly that kind of streamwise vorticity. Forecasters at the Storm Prediction Center had flagged the setup more than 24 hours in advance. This is the part that explains why a single line of thunderstorms can produce one rotating monster while the rest of the line just dumps rain. The monster is the storm whose updraft happened to grab the right kind of spinning air at the right altitude. It is, in a sense, a kind of atmospheric luck. Bad luck for whoever lives below. But shear alone still does not produce a tornado on the ground, it produces a rotating storm. To get the funnel itself, the rotation has to descend, tighten, and reach down through the warm air toward the dirt. That descent is one of the most studied and least fully understood processes in all of meteorology. The next chapter goes into the heart of the storm to follow the rotation as it grows. Inside every violent tornado is a parent, a larger structure that birthed it, fed it, and held it together long after it touched the ground. Meteorologists call that parent the mesocyclone, and it is the part of a supercell that radar operators stare at the hardest when lives are on the line. A mesocyclone is a deep, rotating column of air inside a thunderstorm. Typically, it is 2 to 6 miles wide. It extends thousands of feet up into the sky. It rotates as a single coherent unit, which means the entire updraft of the storm is spinning together rather than as separate gusts. That coherence is what makes a supercell different from every other kind of thunderstorm on Earth. Here is the key fact most people do not realize. The mesocyclone forms before the tornado. It is the precondition. Without a mesocyclone, you almost never get a strong tornado. With one, the odds rise sharply. Even so, only about 30% or fewer of mesocyclones actually produce a tornado. The rest spin themselves out without ever sending a funnel to the ground. That uncertainty is what makes warning the public so difficult. The mesocyclone forms in 3 rough stages. First, the storm acquires rotation aloft. The tilted horizontal vorticity from wind shear is lifted upward by the updraft, and a rotating column begins to spin in the middle altitudes of the storm, usually somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 feet up. This is the mid-level mesocyclone. It is the storm announcing itself as supercellular. Second, the rotation begins to extend downward. A narrower vortex develops closer to the ground, and the rotation now stretches from the mid-levels of the storm down toward the lower atmosphere. This is sometimes called the low-level mesocyclone. It is the dangerous moment. Because once rotation is anchored in the lower atmosphere, the storm is much closer to producing a tornado. Third, that low-level rotation tightens. The diameter shrinks. The wind speed accelerates, just like a figure skater pulling her arms in. This is the moment a tornado becomes likely. Doppler weather radar is what allows meteorologists to see all of this in real time. The radar does not show the air directly. It shows the motion of raindrops, hail, and debris suspended in the air. Where the radar detects winds racing toward it on one side and racing away on the other, in close proximity, that is the rotation signature. Meteorologists call it a velocity couplet. When a couplet shows up high in the storm, it suggests a mid-level mesocyclone. When it appears at low altitudes, the warning urgency rises sharply. On the evening of April 23rd, the radar above Enid lit up with all 3 stages stacked in sequence. The mid-level rotation appeared first. Within minutes it descended. Within minutes more it tightened into a couplet so intense that the National Weather Service issued the tornado emergency before the funnel had even fully matured. There is something else mesocyclones do that listeners should picture. As the rotation organises, the storm itself begins to take on a recognisable shape on radar. The precipitation wraps around the rotation in a curving arm, creating a hook-shaped echo extending southwest from the main storm body. That hook is the visual fingerprint of a tornado producing supercell. Storm chasers and forecasters have spent careers learning to spot it the moment it appears. Here is why mesocyclones matter beyond the science. They are the reason advance warning is even possible. A regular thunderstorm gives you maybe a few minutes of notice before damaging winds hit. A supercell with a clear mesocyclone signature gives you 10 minutes, sometimes 20, sometimes more. That is the gap that allowed every person in Enid to reach a shelter before the wedge arrived. But the mesocyclone is only the parent. It is the cradle, not the child. The actual tornado, the violent column of wind that touches the ground, is born from a process inside the mesocyclone that scientists are still working to fully understand. The next chapter follows the moment of birth itself. There is a moment that meteorologists have spent decades trying to capture. The moment when a rotating storm in the sky reaches down and touches the dirt. That single instant has a name: tornadogenesis. And despite all the radar, all the field campaigns, and all the supercomputer simulations, scientists still cannot fully predict when, where, or even whether it will happen. That uncertainty is one of the strangest gaps in all of modern weather science. Here is what is known. The mid-level rotation in a supercell is not enough on its own to produce a tornado. A spinning column thousands of feet up in the air does not, by itself, drag a funnel to the ground. Something else has to happen at low altitude. Specifically, rotation has to develop near the surface, and that lower rotation has to connect upward into the existing mesocyclone above. Researchers describe this as a three-step process. First, the storm acquires rotation aloft. Second, rotation develops at the ground. Third, that low-level rotation contracts and tightens into a tornado. The first step is the easiest. Wind shear and updrafts build the mid-level mesocyclone almost reliably whenever the atmospheric ingredients are right. The second step is where the science gets harder. Scientists have learned that a feature called the rear flank downdraft plays a critical role. Picture the storm as a tilted, rotating tower. As rain and cooled air fall on the backside of the storm, they create a curving downdraft that wraps around the mesocyclone. That descending air, when it hits the ground at the right angle, can generate spin near the surface. If that ground-level spin happens to align with the column above it, the rotation suddenly becomes a single, vertically continuous structure from cloud base to dirt. The third step is the contraction. The rotating column tightens. Wind speeds accelerate. A funnel cloud descends. Debris begins to lift. A tornado is on the ground. Here is the part that still puzzles atmospheric scientists. Two supercells can look almost identical on radar. Same shear environment, same instability, same hook echo. One produces a violent tornado, the other produces nothing but rain and wind. Why? Recent research suggests the answer lies in subtle differences in the rear flank downdraft. If the descending air is too cold, it can stabilize the lower atmosphere and shut down tornadogenesis. If the descending air is closer to the surface temperature, it allows the spin to organize and connect upward. The margin between a tornado and no tornado can come down to a difference of just a few degrees in a small pocket of air a few hundred feet across. On the evening of April 23rd, that margin tipped the wrong way. The rear flank downdraft on the supercell over Garfield County was warm enough. The low-level rotation organized. The connection upward locked in, and at 8:11 at night, just southwest of Vance Air Force Base, the funnel reached the ground. For the first few seconds, it was probably almost invisible. A faint whirl of dust at the surface, a small curtain of rain wrapping around it. Then the contraction began. Within 30 seconds, the funnel widened into a stovepipe. Within 3 minutes, it was a wedge. Within 6 minutes, it was producing F4 damage on the southern edge of Enid. This is what meteorologists mean when they say the gap between a quiet evening and a tornado emergency can be measured in moments. The atmosphere does not warn its participants. It executes. There is one more piece of the puzzle. Once the tornado is on the ground, the storm structure itself becomes visible to anyone watching radar. A specific shape begins to emerge in the precipitation pattern. It curves, it hooks, and it points directly at the place where the funnel is grinding through houses and fields. The next chapter is about that fingerprint and how forecasters learn to read it. The first time meteorologists saw a hook echo on radar, they did not know what they were looking at. It was 1953. A supercell was tearing across central Illinois. A young researcher named Donald Staggs, working with the Illinois State Water Survey, watched the radar screen and saw the precipitation curl into a strange shape on the southwest side of the storm. It looked like a question mark hanging off the main echo. Within hours, ground reports confirmed that a violent tornado had been on the ground at exactly the place where the hook had appeared. That single observation changed severe weather forecasting forever. The hook echo became the visual fingerprint of a tornado producing supercell. Every storm chaser, every emergency manager, every National Weather Service forecaster in the United States now learns to spot it as a fundamental skill of the job. Here is what a hook echo actually is. When a supercell develops a strong rotating mesocyclone, the precipitation in the storm begins to wrap around the rotation. Imagine pouring cream into a slowly stirring cup of coffee. The cream does not stay where you poured it, it curls around the stir, tracing a spiral. That is exactly what the rain and hail do inside a rotating storm. The curl extends outward from the main body of the storm, creating a small hooked appendage that points toward the area where rotation is most intense. That hooked appendage is where the tornado lives. Modern Doppler radar systems can see the hook with extraordinary clarity. They can also see the velocity couplet inside the hook, where wind motion toward and away from the radar appears side by side. Together, the hook echo and the couplet form what forecasters call a tornado signature. When both appear at low altitude, the warning level escalates immediately. There is an even more specific signal. Modern radars can detect debris itself. When a tornado is on the ground and lofting pieces of buildings, trees, vehicles, and dirt into the air, those objects show up on radar as a distinctive return called a tornado debris signature. Or, in the terminology forecasters often use on television, a debris ball. A debris ball is one of the most haunting things a radar operator can see. It means a confirmed, significant tornado is actively destroying things at that exact location. Not a possible tornado. Not a likely one. A real one, throwing pieces of houses high enough into the sky that an electromagnetic pulse can bounce off them. On the evening of April 23rd, the radar in Enid produced all three signatures in sequence. The hook curled out of the supercell on its southwest flank. The velocity couplet tightened inside the hook. And as the tornado bored into the southern edge of the city, a debris ball lit up the screen. Forecasters at the National Weather Service office in Norman were watching the destruction in real time, in pixels, before the first emergency call had even reached dispatch. There is an interesting paradox in modern severe weather forecasting. The radar has become so good at detecting tornadoes that warning lead times have improved significantly over the past several decades, but the storms themselves have not become easier to fight. Warning a community 10 or 15 minutes ahead of a wedge tornado does not stop the wedge. It only helps people get out of its way. Listeners should picture the moment from the forecaster's perspective. A meteorologist sits in a darkened office in Norman, Oklahoma, watching a screen. The hook appears, the couplet sharpens, the debris ball blooms. They reach for the microphone and issue the tornado emergency. They say the words. And then they wait, helpless, as the storm finishes what it started. That is the human cost of working severe weather forecasting in tornado country. The information is precise, the control over the outcome is zero. But there is one thing the radar struggles to see in real time. A specific feature inside the most violent tornadoes that turns them into something stranger and more destructive than even a normal wedge. A feature that the people of Enid, looking up that night, may have actually witnessed with their own eyes. The next chapter goes inside the Multivortex tornado. When Mark Fox, the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service office in Norman, looked at one specific photograph of the Enid tornado, he stopped on a particular detail. The tornado in the image had two dark fans of debris extending out from its base. One on the left, one on the right. Together they formed the shape of a V. And to a trained meteorologist, That shape carries a very specific meaning. It is the visual fingerprint of a violent tornado, and often a multi-vortex one. Most people picture a tornado as a single rotating column. One funnel. One core of wind. That picture is correct for most tornadoes. But the strongest tornadoes, the ones that reach F4 and F5 intensity, often contain something extra inside the main column. Smaller, faster, even more violent vortices that orbit around the central rotation like satellites circling a planet. These are called subvortices, or suction vortices, and they are the part of a tornado that turns destruction from severe into something almost impossible to predict on the ground. Here is the mechanism. Inside the main funnel of a violent tornado, the air is rotating at extreme speeds. As the rotation tightens and the central pressure drops, the airflow becomes unstable. The single, smooth column of wind breaks down into multiple smaller columns, each spinning at speeds that can exceed the speed of the main vortex by 20 or 30 miles per hour. These smaller columns then orbit around the central axis, sweeping through the damage path like spinning blades on a much larger spinning wheel. The result is a damage pattern that has confused homeowners for generations. 2 houses on the same street, identical construction, 20 feet apart. One is leveled to its foundation, the other has only minor roof damage. A storm survey team will look at that pattern and immediately know what happened. A subvortex passed directly over the destroyed home and missed the one next door. The V-shaped debris pattern that Mark Fox pointed to in the Enid photograph is a clue to this internal structure. As the violent rotation lifts dirt, dust, and shredded building materials into the air, the orbital paths of the subvortices spread the debris outward in a roughly symmetrical fan. Lower-end tornadoes do not generate enough wind energy to throw material that wide or that high. Only the strongest can. Storm chasers who have witnessed multi-vortex tornadoes describe them in haunting terms. The main funnel appears almost stationary, but inside it smaller dark columns are visible, racing around the perimeter at high speed. To stand near one is to watch chaos that is somehow also organised. The wind sound shifts pitch as each subvortex passes, creating a roar that pulses rather than holds steady. The Enid tornado almost certainly contained subvortices during its peak intensity. The damage survey supports this. Survey teams found pockets of F4 destruction surrounded by patches of lower-rated damage, even within the same neighbourhood. Power poles were snapped at irregular intervals. Trees in one row were debarked, while trees in the next row were merely uprooted. That patchwork is the signature of multi-vortex behaviour. There is also a reason this internal structure makes warning so difficult. A tornado containing subvortices can produce damage paths that are wider than the main funnel itself. The orbital reach of the satellites means that destruction can extend outside the visible boundary of the parent vortex. People who think they are safely outside the tornado's path can suddenly find themselves inside it. Here is the larger meaning of the multivortex phenomenon. It tells scientists that even at the highest end of the enhanced Fujita scale, a tornado is not a single object. It is a system, a nested structure of rotating air, each layer feeding the next, each capable of behaviour the layers above it cannot predict. But the question that lingers above all of this is geographical. Why does this particular kind of violent multi-vortex storm form so often in this particular part of the world? Why does the central United States get more violent tornadoes than every other country on Earth combined? The answer involves 3 pieces of geography that lined up by accident hundreds of millions of years ago. The next chapter explains why Tornado Alley exists. Roughly 75% of all tornadoes ever recorded on Earth happen in one country, the United States. And within the United States, an oversized share of them happen in a corridor running from northern Texas up through Oklahoma, Kansas, and into Nebraska. A corridor that has earned its informal nickname for almost a century. Tornado Alley. There is a reason for this. And it is not random. It is geography on a continental scale lined up almost too perfectly. To the south of Tornado Alley sits the Gulf of Mexico, a warm, shallow body of water that pumps enormous amounts of moisture into the lower atmosphere every spring. The Gulf is the engine. It loads the air with the water vapour that storms need to grow. By April and May, surface dew points across the southern plains regularly climb into the high 60s and low 70s in degrees Fahrenheit. That is fuel-grade humidity. It is the kind of moisture that builds towering thunderstorms in a matter of hours. To the west of Tornado Alley sits the Rocky Mountains and the high deserts of the American Southwest. As prevailing winds flow eastward off those mountains, they descend, dry out, and warm. By the time they reach the western edge of the plains, they are hot, dry, and fast. This is the air mass that creates the dry line. To the north of Tornado Alley sits Canada. From there, cold polar air masses periodically push southward, especially in spring. When that cold air crashes into the warm, moist Gulf air rolling north, the boundary between them becomes a battle zone, a cold front, the exact kind of boundary that triggers explosive thunderstorm development. Now stack those three ingredients together. Warm Gulf moisture flowing north at the surface, hot dry air pushing east at middle altitudes, cold polar air diving south aloft. Add in the jet stream, a fast river of wind in the upper atmosphere that flows from west to east at hundreds of miles per hour. And you have a recipe that exists nowhere else on Earth in such a concentrated form. Other parts of the world have one or two of these ingredients. Argentina has the Pampas, and a similar setup that generates some of the strongest hailstorms on the planet. Bangladesh sees devastating tornadoes during certain monsoon transitions. Eastern Europe and parts of Australia get occasional severe outbreaks, but no other region on the planet stacks all the ingredients together as reliably as the central United States. That is why Enid sits where it does in this story. It is not bad luck that an F4 tornado tore through Garfield County. It is geography. The same geography that has been producing violent storms in that part of Oklahoma for thousands of years before the town was built. Here is something most listeners do not realize. The boundaries of Tornado Alley are not actually fixed. The corridor was originally defined in 1950 2x2 Air Force meteorologists studying storm patterns over the southern plains. They drew the boundary based on the data they had at the time. But more recent research has shown that the most active part of the corridor is shifting east. Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky now experience tornado frequencies and fatality rates that rival or exceed parts of the original Tornado Alley. Some atmospheric scientists now refer to this shifted region as Dixie Alley. The reasons for the eastward shift are still being studied. Changes in Gulf moisture distribution may play a role. Shifts in the jet stream pattern over recent decades may also contribute. Climate signals are being investigated, though scientists are careful not to attribute specific outbreaks to climate change alone, since attribution science for tornadoes remains genuinely difficult. What is not in doubt is this. The geographic engine that produces Tornado Alley is still running. It is still loading the air every spring. It is still pulling moisture north, dry air east, and cold air south. And on certain afternoons in April and May, when all three ingredients align, it generates storms that are not just dangerous, but record-setting. The Enid tornado was one of those storms, and so were the hailstones that fell across Kansas the same night, some of which were so large that survey teams had to measure them with rulers because they would not fit inside a standard hail gauge. The next chapter is about what falls from these storms when they do not produce a tornado, but produce something nearly as destructive instead. While the Enid tornado was still on the ground, something else was falling out of the sky 200 miles to the north. Hail, but not the small pea-sized pellets that ping off a windshield and disappear. These were ice spheres the size of baseballs. One stone measured near Marion, Kansas, came in at 4 inches across. Another, near Bremen, Oklahoma, measured 3 3/4 inches. For context, a 4-inch hailstone weighs roughly half a pound. When it falls from a thunderstorm cloud, it accelerates to terminal velocity. which for a stone that size is around 100 miles per hour. That means a single hailstone hitting a car roof carries roughly the same impact energy as a brick dropped from a fifth-story window. Now imagine thousands of them falling per minute. Across an entire town. That is what some Kansas communities experienced on April 23rd. Hail forms inside the same supercell thunderstorms that produce tornadoes. The mechanism is straightforward, even if the result is anything but. Inside a strong thunderstorm, warm air rises rapidly in the updraft. As it climbs, it cools. At a certain altitude, the temperature drops below freezing. Any water droplets carried up that high turn into ice. If the updraft is weak, those small ice particles fall back to Earth as graupel or sleet. Tiny, harmless, easily swept off a sidewalk. If the updraft is strong, something different happens. The ice particle is held aloft by the rising air. It collects more supercooled water on its surface. Each layer freezes into solid ice. The stone grows. Eventually, gravity wins and the stone begins to fall. But if the storm is strong enough, the falling stone gets caught in another updraft and sent back up to grow more. Some hailstones make this round trip several times before they finally exit the storm. The largest hailstone ever officially recorded in the United States fell in Vivian, South Dakota in 2010. It measured 8 inches across. It weighed nearly 2 pounds. It punched a hole in the ground when it landed. The 4-inch stones that fell over Kansas on April 23rd were not record-breaking. But they were destructive on a scale that most Americans have never witnessed in person. Footage captured at Springfield-Branson National Airport in Missouri the following day showed wind-driven hail lashing the airport buildings. Crews scrambled to cover damaged vehicles with tarps. Windshields shattered. Roof tiles cracked. Hail damage in the United States now causes more property loss in some years than tornadoes do, even though tornadoes draw most of the headlines. There is a reason hail and tornadoes appear in the same storms. They share an ingredient: powerful updrafts. Specifically the kind of strong, sustained vertical wind that is also necessary to tilt horizontal vorticity into a rotating mesocyclone. When the updraft is fast enough to suspend large hailstones aloft, it is usually fast enough to support tornado development as well. Forecasters watch for both signatures simultaneously. A storm that produces giant hail without producing a tornado is sometimes called a high precipitation supercell. The same storm could easily have produced a tornado if a few small atmospheric variables had shifted. The fact that it did not is not because the storm was weak. It is because the rotation never quite reached the ground. Here is the larger meaning of giant hail. It is not separate from the tornado threat. It is a different expression of the same atmospheric violence. When the air over a region is loaded with the kind of energy that can grow 4-inch ice balls in the sky, it is the same air that can drop an F4 tornado on a town. The two phenomena are siblings. They come from the same parent. That is why severe weather warnings during major outbreaks include both threats simultaneously. A community might escape the tornado risk, but find every car windshield in the neighborhood smashed by the morning. It is the same storm, just a different way of inflicting damage. But while Enid and the Kansas hail towns were absorbing the first night of the outbreak, the system that produced them was already moving. Within 48 hours, the same atmospheric setup would jump state lines and lock onto a second target, a small Texas town just west of Dallas. The next chapter is about what happened when the outbreak moved south. The town of Mineral Wells sits about 80 miles west of Dallas-Fort Worth. It has a population of roughly 15,000. It is the kind of place most Americans have never heard of and probably never will, except for one reason. On the evening of April 28th, a tornado tore through it. The storm hit around 5 in the afternoon. By the time it passed, a portion of the town had been flattened. Multiple homes were damaged. A wide swath of the industrial area was destroyed. 2 people were taken to the hospital. Several more were treated on scene for minor injuries. There were no immediate reports of deaths. For Mineral Wells, that outcome was a small mercy. For meteorologists watching the same outbreak that started in Enid 5 days earlier, it was confirmation of something else. The system was not ending. It was migrating. Here is the key fact that most people miss when they watch news coverage of severe weather. A multi-day outbreak is not a series of unrelated storms. It is one large atmospheric pattern stalled over a region, producing fresh storms every afternoon as the sun reheats the surface and the same upper-level dynamics reload the engine. In the case of the April 23rd to April 28th sequence, that pattern was a near-stationary extratropical cyclone. In plain language, a slow-moving low-pressure system parked over the central United States. The cyclone pulled moisture north from the Gulf. It pulled cold air south from Canada. It maintained the dry line. It held the wind shear in place. And it refused to move. Day after day, fresh thunderstorms initiated along its boundaries. Day after day, somewhere in its zone of influence, a community got hit. April 23rd was Enid. April 25th brought a high-end F2 through Runaway Bay, Texas. April 26th and 27th saw more than 200 reports of damaging wind and large hail across Missouri, Arkansas, Indiana, and Illinois. April 28th was Mineral Wells. 6 days. Hundreds of miles of separation between the strikes. One single weather pattern responsible for all of it. The Mineral Wells tornado was not the strongest of the outbreak. Survey teams had not yet finalised its rating in the immediate aftermath. But the storm did something that smaller communities fear most. It targeted the parts of town that hold the local economy, the industrial area, the places where people work. Multiple commercial structures suffered damage. Local officials imposed a 10 p.m. curfew that night to keep curious onlookers and would-be looters away from the destruction. Mineral Wells Fire Chief Ryan Dunn confirmed the casualty figures. Mineral Wells Police Chief Tim Dennison announced the curfew. Mayor and city officials began the slow, exhausting process of damage assessment that any small town goes through after a tornado strike. They knew, as every Plains and Texas community knows, that the next morning would bring volunteers and donations from neighbouring towns. They also knew that recovery would take months. There is a pattern in how these strikes unfold that is worth noting. Smaller communities like Mineral Wells often face longer recovery timelines than larger cities. They have fewer local resources. Their tax bases are thinner. Their construction industries are smaller. A single bad storm can reset the economic trajectory of a town for a decade. The federal disaster declaration process exists precisely for this reason. Once a state governor formally requests assistance and the president approves it, federal funds flow into affected counties to help with debris removal, individual aid, and infrastructure repair. Oklahoma had already triggered that process for Garfield and Kay counties on April 24th. Texas would soon follow for the counties hit later in the outbreak. Here is the larger meaning of Mineral Wells. It is the proof that an outbreak does not end with the first big strike. The same atmospheric setup that produces a violent tornado in Oklahoma on Thursday is fully capable of producing another one in Texas the following Tuesday. The communities in between have to assume that any night during that span could be their night. But Mineral Wells was not the deadliest moment of the outbreak. That had already happened 2 days earlier to a small lakeside community north of Fort Worth. The next chapter is about the night the outbreak turned fatal. The deaths came on a Saturday night, April 25th. The setting was a small lakeside community in North Texas called Runaway Bay, about 80 miles northwest of Dallas. A community of fewer than 1,500 people, built around a reservoir, dotted with vacation homes and trailers and modest year-round residences. A high-end F2 tornado tracked directly through it. By the time the storm had passed, 2 people were dead. Homes were damaged or destroyed, infrastructure was crippled, dozens of residents were displaced. And the multi-day outbreak that had started in Enid 2 days earlier was no longer a story about property damage. It was a story about lives lost. A high-end F2 means winds in the range of 135 miles per hour. That is well below the violence of an F4. But the difference between survivable and fatal in a tornado often has nothing to do with the rating. It has to do with the structures in the path. Mobile homes and lightly constructed houses can be destroyed by winds far below the F4 threshold. The enhanced Fujita scale measures damage to engineered structures. It does not capture what happens when a 130 5-mile-per-hour wind hits a single wide mobile home, with the underside not anchored to the ground. This is one of the persistent and difficult truths about tornado fatalities in the United States. A disproportionate share of deaths occur in mobile homes and manufactured housing, even though those structures represent a small fraction of total American homes. The reason is straightforward. They cannot withstand the wind speeds that even moderate tornadoes produce, and many of them lack underground shelters within easy walking distance. In Runaway Bay, the path of the tornado intersected exactly the kind of housing that is most vulnerable. The result was the kind of fatality count that smaller communities dread. The outbreak had been forecast. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk for parts of Oklahoma and Texas earlier that day. Tornado watches were in effect across the region. Local emergency managers had communicated the threat through every channel available. Sirens sounded, phones buzzed with cell broadcast alerts. Television and radio meteorologists tracked the storm in real time. And still, 2 people died. Here is the hard fact that emergency managers and meteorologists carry with them after every outbreak. Warnings save lives, but they cannot save everyone. Some people are asleep when the alerts come in. Some are caught travelling and have nowhere to shelter. Some live in homes that simply cannot survive a direct hit. Some never receive the warning at all because of cell coverage gaps or power outages. The fatalities in Runaway Bay also added urgency to the larger pattern. By the time those 2 deaths were confirmed, the death toll for the outbreak had begun to grow. A man in Kent County, Michigan, had been killed earlier in the cycle when a tree fell on him during high winds from a related weather system. He had warned his friends about the falling tree before it hit him, an action they later said had saved their lives but cost him his own. The number of fatalities was not catastrophic by historical tornado outbreak standards. Some past outbreaks have killed hundreds. The tri-state tornado of 1925 killed nearly 700 people in a single afternoon. The April 2011 super outbreak killed more than 350. But every fatality in Runaway Bay was a person whose family is now living the kind of long, slow grief that does not show up in news coverage 2 weeks later. The local pastor who has to plan a service, the neighbour who has to walk past the empty house, the kid who returns to school knowing one of the desks will stay empty. Here is the larger meaning of the North Texas deaths. They are a reminder that severe weather science is not just a technical discipline, it is an applied one. Every advance in radar, every improvement in warning lead time, every piece of public outreach about shelter strategies exists for the purpose of preventing exactly these kinds of losses. Some nights the system works. Enid had no fatalities despite F4 damage. Other nights, no matter how good the warnings are, the storm finds someone who cannot get to safety in time. But forecasters had a specific phrase they had used in the days leading up to the worst nights of the outbreak. A phrase that the National Weather Service uses only sparingly. A phrase that, when issued, signals that the atmosphere is about to do something rare and catastrophic. The next chapter is about those 4 words, and what they mean. Just before 11 at night on April 27th, the National Weather Service office in Little Rock, Arkansas, released a warning that included a specific phrase. The words were, "particularly dangerous situation." To most listeners, that phrase might sound like ordinary weather alert language. It is not. It is one of the rarest and most carefully used designations in the entire American severe weather warning system. Forecasters do not use it often. They do not use it casually. When they do use it, they are telling the public, in essentially direct terms, that the night ahead has a real chance of producing fatalities, and that complacency will not be forgiven by the atmosphere. Here is how the phrase fits into the broader system. The Storm Prediction Center and local National Weather Service offices issue several types of products on severe weather days. Convective outlooks describe the general risk for a region over the coming hours. Watches are issued when conditions are favourable for severe storms or tornadoes within a defined area. Warnings are issued when severe weather is actively occurring or imminent. A standard tornado watch tells you to stay alert. It means tornadoes are possible somewhere in the watch area over the next several hours. Most tornado watches do not result in widespread destruction. Most are routine. A particularly dangerous situation watch is different. The designation is added to a watch when forecasters believe the conditions are not just favourable for tornadoes, but favourable for strong, long-track tornadoes capable of causing significant damage and loss of life. The phrase originated in the 1960s as a way to differentiate the worst-case scenarios from ordinary watches. Over time, it became a kind of meteorological shorthand for "this is the night you do not ignore." Statistically, fewer than a handful of these particularly dangerous situation watches are issued each year. They are reserved for setups that historically have produced violent outbreaks. Conditions like extreme low-level wind shear, very steep lapse rates, abundant low-level moisture, and strong upper-level dynamics, all stack together in a way that virtually guarantees significant tornadic activity. On April 27th, the Storm Prediction Center issued a particularly dangerous situation tornado watch at 2:45 in the afternoon, Central Time. It covered northeast Arkansas, western Tennessee, southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, southwest Indiana, and western Kentucky. The phrasing in the accompanying discussion was direct. The atmosphere across that region was capable of producing multiple strong to intense tornadoes. Later that night, when a destructive tornado moved through Hanover and surrounding communities in Stone County, Arkansas, the Little Rock office escalated to a tornado warning that included the same phrasing. Particularly dangerous situation. That tornado stayed on the ground for about 10 miles. Debris was lofted hundreds of feet into the air. Homes and vehicles were damaged. Power lines were down across the area. Emergency crews worked through the night. Here is the part of the warning system that listeners should understand. The particularly dangerous situation phrasing is calibrated precisely because of its rarity. If forecasters used it for every severe weather day, the public would learn to ignore it. By restricting it to the worst-case setups, the National Weather Service ensures that when it appears, it carries weight. This is the same philosophy behind the tornado emergency phrasing used in Enid 4 nights earlier. Both phrases exist for the same reason. They are the strongest words the warning system can deploy, and they are reserved for the moments when those words might be the difference between a person reaching a shelter or not. There is a darker truth underneath this. The fact that particularly dangerous situation watches exist at all is an admission that the standard warning system is sometimes not enough, that on certain nights the atmosphere produces something so dangerous that ordinary alert language cannot capture it. The phrase is, in effect, an emergency translation, a way of saying to the public, this is not normal, please act accordingly. But the underlying question, the one that has haunted meteorologists throughout this 6-day stretch, is why the atmosphere stayed loaded for so long in the first place. Why didn't the pattern move on after the first big strike? Why did Enid lead to Runaway Bay, which led to Mineral Wells, which led to Stone County, which led to even more storms forecast for the days ahead? The answer is something forecasters call a stalled system, and it is the most frustrating and most dangerous kind of weather pattern there is. The next chapter explains how an entire continent's atmosphere can simply lock in place and refuse to move. The atmosphere is supposed to keep moving. That is the rule. Air over the United States flows generally west to east, dragged by the jet stream, cycled by pressure systems that rise and fall and slide off the continent within a few days. Most weather patterns, even violent ones, pass through. They arrive, they produce their storms, they leave. Sometimes the system breaks the rule. It parks. It settles in over a region and refuses to move. And when that happens during a severe weather setup, the consequences compound day after day. Meteorologists call this a stalled pattern, and it is exactly what locked over the central United States from April 23rd onward. Here is the mechanism. The jet stream, that fast river of upper-level wind that normally pulls weather systems eastward across the country, sometimes develops large bends called troughs and ridges. A trough is a southward dip in the jet stream. A ridge is a northward bulge. When troughs and ridges line up in just the right configuration, they can effectively pin a low-pressure system in place. The system has nowhere to go. The air around it gets blocked from advancing. For severe weather, that is the worst-case structure. A stalled low-pressure system continues to pull warm, moist Gulf air northward into the plains every single day. It continues to maintain the dry line. It continues to support the wind shear environment. And every afternoon, when the surface heats up, fresh thunderstorms initiate along the same boundaries. Different communities get hit, but the underlying engine never resets. The Wikipedia entry tracking this specific outbreak documented the pattern in plain terms. The severe weather from April 23rd through April 26th was caused by a near-stationary extratropical cyclone over the central United States. On April 27th, that system finally began to weaken, but a second intense cyclone moved in just south of it, replacing the first one and continuing the cycle. In other words, when the original engine finally started to wind down, a second engine took over. The atmospheric setup was so favourable for severe weather that even when the first system tried to leave, the next system simply slid into the same slot and kept the conveyor belt running. This kind of pattern is exhausting for everyone involved. Forecasters work double shifts for days on end. Emergency managers cannot reset their resources between events. Power crews finish restoring electricity in one county just in time to be deployed to the next. And the residents of affected regions live in a state of low-grade alert that becomes its own kind of trauma. Every morning is calm. Every afternoon brings the question, will tonight be the night? Stalled patterns are not unique to the United States. They produce devastating floods in Europe. They drive heat waves over Asia. They worsen droughts across Africa. The blocking dynamics that create them are a recognized feature of mid-latitude weather, and atmospheric scientists have studied them for decades. What makes them especially dangerous over the plains is the geographic setup. Tornado Alley sits at the intersection of three air masses, each driven by its own large-scale circulation. When the jet stream pattern locks all three of those circulations into place, the alley becomes a continuous severe weather machine. Day after day, storm after storm, state after state. Some research has begun to ask whether stalled patterns are becoming more common globally. The findings are still debated. Some studies suggest that a warming Arctic may be slowing the jet stream and making it more prone to large bends. Other studies are more cautious, pointing out that natural variability remains a strong factor and that detecting trends in stalling requires very long records. Atmospheric scientists are careful here. The science of attribution for jet stream behaviour is genuinely complicated, and conclusions are still being refined. What is not in doubt is what this particular stalled pattern did over the central United States in late April 2026. It produced the longest sustained severe weather outbreak in months, killed at least 3 people, injured many more, and damaged communities across at least 7 states. Underneath that stall, however, was a smaller and equally important feature: the exact place where the warm air, the cold air, and the dry air all met. A specific point on a weather map where storms ignite first and most violently. The next chapter is about that triple point. Pull up a weather map of the central United States during a severe weather outbreak, and you will see a specific feature that meteorologists watch obsessively. 3 boundaries meeting at a single point, a cold front pushing south, a warm front lifting north, a dry line drifting east. They converge in one place, and that place becomes the most dangerous square mile of real estate on the continent. It has a name. Forecasters call it the triple point. Here is what makes the triple point so explosive. Each of the three boundaries on its own is capable of triggering thunderstorms. A cold front pushes warm air upward as it advances, often forcing severe storms into a long line. A warm front lifts cooler surface air over warmer air aloft, creating instability. A dry line pushes moist air upward as the dry air rams into it, generating discrete supercells. Where all three boundaries meet, all three lift mechanisms operate simultaneously. The atmosphere has multiple ways to force air upward in the same small area. Add the right wind shear and the right instability, and the result is the most reliable supercell formation zone in any spring outbreak. Think of it like three rivers converging into a single rapids. Each tributary brings its own current. At the confluence, the water churns harder than any single stream could on its own. On April 23rd, the triple point was sitting almost exactly over northern Oklahoma. The cold front was draped across Kansas. The warm front was lifting north out of the Texas Panhandle. The dry line was stretched along a line cutting across the western plains. They met somewhere just north of Garfield County. Storm chasers, who learned to read these maps the way doctors read X-rays, knew where to position themselves the moment the morning models came in. The first major supercell of the day initiated almost exactly at the triple point. Within an hour, it was rotating. Within 2 hours, it was producing the Enid wedge. There is something almost ritualistic about the way meteorologists discuss triple points. They speak of them in hushed terms. They mark them on maps with circles. They point to the convergence and say, "This is where it will start." The reason is simple. Triple points are where forecasters' best guesses become observable reality. If a triple point lights up with storms in the late afternoon, the rest of the day's forecast is going to play out in violent, predictable order. The behaviour of supercells near triple points is also distinct. Storms that form there are often the longest-lived and most intense storms of the day. They have access to the best moisture, the strongest wind shear, and the most efficient lift. They can travel for hours, hundreds of miles, producing multiple tornadoes along their tracks. Storm chasers refer to these as anchor storms. Everyone in the chase community converges on them. Every news helicopter follows them. Every radar operator watches them with maximum attention. For people living in the path, the triple point is invisible. They do not see the convergence on a weather map. They do not know that three boundaries are meeting just over their county. They only know that the sky turns dark, the air feels strange, and the warning sirens sound earlier than usual. Here is the larger meaning of the triple point. It is one of the cleanest examples in atmospheric science of how big-picture weather translates into local catastrophe. A continental-scale interaction between air masses, condensed into a single geographic point, produces the storms that flatten neighbourhoods. The forecast, the chase, the warning, and the destruction all radiate outward from a place no human eye can directly see. But the triple point is just the trigger. The actual energy that powers the supercell comes from somewhere else. From a measurement that meteorologists obsess over more than almost any other on severe weather days, a number that, when it climbs high enough, tells the forecast team that whatever happens that afternoon is going to happen with violence. The next chapter is about that hidden fuel measurement. There is a number that meteorologists check every morning during severe weather season. It does not show up on television forecasts. It does not appear in regular weather apps. But for the people whose job it is to predict tornadoes, it might be the single most important variable in the atmosphere. It is called CAPE. Convective Available Potential Energy. CAPE is a measurement of how much energy is sitting in the air, waiting to be released. The higher the number, the more violent the storms can become if a trigger is in place. Here is how it works in plain language. The atmosphere has layers of air at different temperatures and humidities. When a parcel of air at the surface is lifted upward, it cools as it rises. If the cooling parcel remains warmer than the air around it at every altitude, it will keep rising on its own, without needing any further push. That self-sustaining rise is called convection. It is what builds thunderstorms. CAPE measures exactly how much extra warmth, and therefore how much extra rising energy, the parcel has compared to the surrounding air. The number is calculated in units of joules per kilogram. To listeners, those units do not matter. What matters is the threshold values that meteorologists use to gauge danger. A CAPE value below 500 is generally a calm atmosphere. Storms, if they form at all, will be weak. A value between 500 and 1000 suggests moderate instability. Storms can form, but they are usually well behaved. Above 1000, the atmosphere becomes capable of severe weather. Above 2000, the conditions are favourable for supercells. Above 3000, forecasters start to use words like extreme. On April 17, 2026, during the major outbreak that produced 80 tornadoes from Oklahoma to Michigan, CAPE values across Kansas and Iowa reached 3,000 joules per kilogram. That is the kind of number that makes meteorologists clear their schedules and stay at the office past midnight. Wikipedia's entry for that earlier outbreak documented those readings explicitly. In the lead-up to April 23rd, the CAPE values across northern Oklahoma were similarly high. Combined with strong wind shear and the dryline trigger, the setup was textbook for violent supercell development. Forecasters knew the energy was there. They could see it in the morning soundings. They could see it in the model output. The only remaining question was whether the cap would break in time for storms to use it. It did. By late afternoon on April 23rd, the cap had eroded over Garfield County. The moment it failed, all of that stored CAPE began to release into the rising columns of warm air feeding the new thunderstorms. The storms exploded upward. Cloud tops reached 50,000 feet within minutes. The updrafts inside the strongest cells were strong enough to suspend hailstones the size of baseballs. There is an analogy worth picturing. CAPE is like the fuel in a tank. The cap is the ignition lock. The trigger, whether it is a dry line, a front, or a warm sector, is the spark. You can have a full tank of fuel, but without a spark, nothing happens. You can have a spark, but with an empty tank, nothing happens. When all three line up, the result is combustion at atmospheric scale. CAPE on its own does not guarantee tornadoes. A storm can have enormous instability and still produce only rain and wind if the wind shear is wrong. Tornadoes require both the energy of CAPE and the rotation of shear, working together. But high CAPE is what makes a tornadic supercell capable of reaching F4 or F5 intensity. Without it, the funnel does not have enough updraft strength to sustain itself at violent speeds. Here is the larger meaning of CAPE for the listener. Every severe weather forecast in the United States is, underneath its public-facing language, a calculation about how much CAPE is available, where the wind shear is, and what triggers will be active. The morning of any major outbreak, the forecast team is essentially asking three questions. How much fuel is in the tank? How rotated is the air? And where will the cap break? When all three questions get the wrong answer at the same time, you get April 23rd in Enid. But there is one more pattern in how supercells behave that explains why some storms in an outbreak become catastrophic while others fizzle. It involves where in the storm field the strongest cell forms relative to the rest. The next chapter is about the lonely supercell that races ahead of the line. There is a pattern that storm chasers know to watch for during outbreaks. When a long line of thunderstorms forms across a region, most of the cells in the line behave similarly. They produce damaging winds, they drop hail, they generate the occasional brief, weak tornado. But somewhere in the line, sometimes ahead of it and sometimes off to the side, a single isolated supercell forms in its own pocket of air. That isolated storm is often the one that produces the violent long-track tornadoes. Meteorologists call it a discrete supercell. Storm chasers sometimes call it the lone wolf. And the reason it becomes so dangerous comes down to a single concept: inflow. Here is what is happening. When thunderstorms form in a tightly packed line, Each cell competes with its neighbours for the warm, moist, low-level air that fuels updrafts. There is only so much Gulf moisture in any given pocket of atmosphere. When dozens of storms try to pull from the same supply at the same time, none of them get enough. They all weaken slightly. The line stays severe, but no individual storm in the line reaches its full potential. A discrete supercell, by contrast, has the entire surrounding atmosphere to itself. There are no neighbouring storms competing for the same warm, humid air. The storm can ingest unimpeded inflow from all directions. The updraft strengthens, the mesocyclone intensifies, the rotation tightens, and the storm becomes capable of producing tornadoes that the line-embedded storms simply cannot match. This is exactly what happened in the April 17th outbreak earlier in the month. A pair of supercells formed well ahead of the main line over the Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin border. Wikipedia's entry for that outbreak documented the result. Those two discrete storms produced multiple strong tornadoes in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, including a multivortex F2 near Lena, Illinois, and an F3 near Warsaw, Wisconsin, that heavily damaged several homes. The line behind them was severe but produced relatively few tornadoes by comparison. On April 23rd, the same dynamic played out over Oklahoma. Multiple supercells formed across northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas in late afternoon. Several of them became tornadic. But one cell, the one that tracked east across Garfield County, became the dominant storm of the entire outbreak. It had access to the cleanest inflow. It moved into the warmest, most unstable air. It produced the Enid wedge. There is something almost biological about how discrete supercells behave. They form, they grow, they dominate their local atmosphere. They feed on the surrounding air for hours. They produce successive tornadoes as their mesocyclones cycle through phases of strengthening and weakening. And then, eventually, they exhaust their fuel supply or merge into a line that has caught up to them, and they die. A long-tracked discrete supercell can travel hundreds of miles in a single afternoon. The Enid storm itself was relatively short-lived as supercells go, with the wedge tornado on the ground for 37 minutes and the parent storm continuing to produce weaker tornadoes afterward. But some historic discrete supercells have produced tornadoes for 6 or 7 hours and tracked across multiple states. Forecasters watch for discrete cell formation with particular care. The reason is that discrete supercells are also the hardest to warn for, in some ways, because they often appear in regions where the main line has not yet arrived. Communities not under a tornado watch can suddenly find themselves under a tornado warning when an isolated storm forms ahead of the main system. The lead time for a discrete cell can be shorter than for a line storm because the threat appears more suddenly on radar. Here is the larger meaning of the discrete supercell. It is the part of an outbreak that produces the headlines. The reason is simple. The most violent tornadoes almost always come from these isolated dominant storms. If you read a news report about a town being flattened, an F4 or F5 rating, a long damage path, you are almost certainly reading about a discrete supercell. But not every dangerous wind event during the April outbreak came from a tornado or a supercell. There was another phenomenon that killed a man in Michigan, a phenomenon that most Americans have never heard of, but one that produces some of the most surprising windstorms in severe weather. The next chapter is about the wake low. A 39-year-old man was killed in Kent County, Michigan, on the evening of April 27th. A tree fell on him during a sudden burst of high winds. Friends of the man told authorities that he had warned them of the falling tree before it hit him. His warning gave them time to move. His own movement came too late. What killed him was not a tornado. It was not a thunderstorm in the traditional sense. It was a phenomenon that almost no one outside of professional meteorology has ever heard of. A wake low. A wake low is a small region of unusually low atmospheric pressure that forms behind a moving line of thunderstorms or rain. The mechanism is subtle but powerful. As a line of storms passes through a region, it leaves behind a wake of cooled, sinking air. That sinking air can sometimes accelerate downward in a specific way that creates a sharp pressure drop at the surface, just behind the trailing edge of the rain. When that pressure drop is steep enough, the surrounding atmosphere rushes in to fill the gap. Wind speeds at the surface can suddenly accelerate to severe levels, sometimes 70 or 80 miles per hour, sometimes higher. The wind seems to come out of nowhere, often after the rain has already passed and the sky has begun to clear. That last part is what makes wake lows so dangerous. People who took shelter during the storm assume the threat is over once the rain stops. They go outside to inspect their property, they walk to their cars, they check on neighbours, and then a wave of high winds arrives that looks, on the radar, like nothing at all. In Kent County, Michigan, that is exactly what happened. Some areas in Michigan and Wisconsin saw damage from this exact phenomenon on April 27th. The wind that killed the man was not the storm itself, it was the storm's afterimage. There is a related phenomenon called a derecho that listeners may have heard of. A derecho is a long-lived, fast-moving line of straight-line winds, typically embedded within or produced by a strong thunderstorm complex. Derechos can travel hundreds of miles and produce wind damage equivalent to a strong tornado, but in a long, narrow swath rather than a localized path. The 2020 derecho across the Midwest caused $11 billion in damage and is considered one of the costliest thunderstorm events in American history. Wake lows are smaller and less famous than derechos, but they share a key characteristic. They produce dangerous winds without the visual cues that traditional thunderstorms provide. There is no advancing wall cloud. There is no obvious funnel. There may not even be visible rain at the moment the winds peak. The danger arrives almost invisibly. Forecasters do their best to warn for these events. The National Weather Service can issue severe thunderstorm warnings or special wind advisories when wake low development is suspected. But the lead time is often shorter than for tornadoes, because wake lows form rapidly behind storm complexes and the wind acceleration can be sudden. Here is the part of severe weather that most public messaging does not fully capture. The danger does not always come from the obvious source. A tornado is the headline. But the death toll from any major outbreak often includes people killed by phenomena that are smaller, quieter, and less photogenic. Falling trees in straight-line wind events. Lightning strikes during the build-up to the main storm. Flash flooding in the aftermath. Structures collapsing days later under accumulated water damage. The April outbreak so far had produced confirmed deaths from at least 2 of these secondary phenomena. The wake low in Michigan, the deadly tornadoes in Texas, the injuries from hail across Kansas and Missouri, and the fatality count was still preliminary as the system continued to spin. There is another consequence of multi-day severe weather that does not show up in death tolls but affects an enormous number of people. The grid. Power infrastructure across multiple states had been hammered by 6 straight days of wind, hail, and lightning. The next chapter is about what happens when an outbreak knocks out electricity to hundreds of thousands of homes simultaneously. By early Tuesday morning of the outbreak, more than 300,000 people across the affected region were without electricity. Tracking site poweroutage.us, which compiles utility company data in near real time, reported the figure during the early hours of April 28th. 60,000 of those outages were in Wisconsin and Michigan. Another large share was in the southern states absorbing the latest storm cycle. The combined outage count for Wisconsin and Michigan had reached 120,000 the previous evening before utility crews began restoration work. 300,000 people. Without lights, without refrigeration, without internet, without working stoplights at intersections, without medical equipment for those at home on oxygen or other power-dependent devices. Across multiple states. For multiple days, here is what most listeners do not realize. The American electrical grid is, in practice, a fragile system. It is also one of the most impressive feats of engineering humanity has ever built. The continental United States grid links thousands of generating stations hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines, and millions of distribution wires into a single synchronized machine. Electricity flows through it at the speed of light. Demand and supply are balanced second by second by computer systems that monitor frequency, voltage, and load. But that grid is also strung across millions of utility poles, each one potentially in the path of any tornado, any wake low, any falling tree. When a severe weather outbreak hits a region, the damage to distribution infrastructure can be enormous and surprisingly hard to repair quickly. A typical wooden utility pole has a service life of about 40 years. They are spaced roughly 100 to 150 feet apart along distribution lines. In a region with a damage path of 9 miles like the Enid tornado track, that means roughly 300 to 400 poles potentially in the line of impact. If a fraction of those are snapped, the entire feeder line goes dead. Restoration requires physically replacing each broken pole, restringing the wires, and reconnecting the service drops to individual homes. This is not work that can be done by software updates. It requires line crews in trucks with cranes and augers. It requires staging equipment, sometimes from multiple states. It requires daylight, because line work at night in damaged terrain is hazardous, and it requires the storms to have stopped so that crews can work without being electrocuted by re-energized wires or struck by new debris. In the April outbreak, the difficulty was compounded by the fact that the storms did not stop. The community would suffer damage on Thursday night. Crews would arrive Friday morning to begin restoration. By Friday evening, a new round of storms would be moving through the same region. Crews would have to retreat. By Saturday, fresh damage would be added to old damage. The restoration timeline kept getting reset. Mutual aid agreements between utility companies are designed for exactly this kind of scenario. When one utility's territory is overwhelmed, neighbouring utilities send line crews to help. After major outbreaks, line trucks from a dozen states can converge on a single affected region. The April outbreak triggered mutual aid responses across the plains, the Midwest, and the South. Here is the part of power outages that affects people in ways that do not show up in the headlines. Refrigerators full of food spoil after a day without power. Medications that require refrigeration become unusable. Home medical devices like CPAP machines and oxygen concentrators stop working. Schools close. Businesses lose revenue. Restaurants throw out inventory. Gas stations cannot pump fuel. ATMs do not work. Cell towers, when their backup batteries run out after a few hours, go offline. Communication itself becomes unreliable. For elderly residents, people with disabilities, and families with young children, an extended outage during severe weather is more than an inconvenience. It is a health risk. There is a larger pattern visible across all of these effects. A modern community is dependent on electricity in ways that a community 50 years ago was not. The reliance on refrigeration, electronic communication, and digital infrastructure means that an outage of even a single day touches every aspect of daily life. A 6-day outbreak with persistent outages stretches that dependence to its breaking point. But while utility crews worked to restore power, another group of people had been working continuously throughout the outbreak. Storm chasers with cameras and live streams. Their footage had been broadcast in real time to millions of viewers. The next chapter is about how live storm coverage has changed the way severe weather is experienced by the American public. There is a moment that has become familiar to anyone who follows severe weather in the United States. A storm chaser parked along a rural highway, pointing a camera at a developing tornado as it touches down a half-mile away. The wind picks up, the chaser narrates calmly, the funnel widens, and somewhere across the country, sometimes hundreds of thousands of viewers are watching all of this in real time on their phones. This is what severe weather coverage looks like in 2026. Storm chasing as a discipline is decades old. It began as a small research community in the 1950s and 60s, when atmospheric scientists like Howard Bluestein at the University of Oklahoma started actively driving towards storms to study them up close. For most of its history, chasing was a niche pursuit, practiced by a handful of researchers, photographers, and weather enthusiasts. That changed with the rise of social media and live streaming. Today, professional storm chasers operate full businesses around their work. Some sell footage to television networks and weather services, some run YouTube channels with millions of subscribers. Some are sponsored by weather technology companies. The most sophisticated chasers drive vehicles equipped with cellular hotspots, mobile radar receivers, multiple cameras, and live broadcast software that can stream their feed to platforms like YouTube and Twitch in real time. During the April outbreak, that live coverage was extensive. Fox Weather had a meteorologist named Hayley Meyer on the ground near Enid. AccuWeather streamed coverage live throughout the multi-day event. Independent chasers like Brandon Clement provided footage of the Enid wedge that was used by news organisations within hours of the storm. The Mineral Wells tornado on April 28th was streamed live by multiple chasers as it formed. For the public, this kind of coverage has changed the relationship between weather and audience. People do not just hear about tornadoes after the fact. They watch them happen. They see the funnel form. They see the debris lift. They see homes get hit. They are participants in the unfolding event in a way that was impossible before. There are real benefits to this. Live footage has helped raise public awareness of severe weather. It has produced data that researchers use to study tornado behaviour. It has, in some cases, provided early visual confirmation of tornadoes that helped local officials issue warnings faster. There are also real risks. The growth of amateur storm chasing has crowded the same rural highways that professional chasers, emergency responders, and local residents need to use during severe weather. Traffic jams in tornado-prone areas have become a documented safety problem. Inexperienced chasers have been killed when they got too close to storms. 3 professional chasers, including the famous tornado researcher Tim Samaras, were killed by an F3 tornado near El Reno, Oklahoma in 2013, when the storm took an unexpected turn. The professional community has responded by emphasizing safety training, clear communication, and respect for the people whose communities are being filmed. Most established chasers will not film survivors directly. They focus on the storm itself. After it passes, they often join recovery efforts rather than continuing to film. There is something else worth noting about live storm footage. It has become, almost by accident, the most powerful form of public weather education ever invented. When a viewer watches a stovepipe tornado form in real time, they learn what one looks like in a way that no textbook can teach. When they watch debris lift hundreds of feet into the air, they understand the scale of the energy involved. When they watch a community get hit, they internalize the importance of warnings and shelters in a way that statistics cannot match. Survey work after major outbreaks has suggested that public awareness of severe weather has improved substantially over the past 2 decades. Some of that is due to better warning technology and better cell broadcast systems, but part of it is due, according to some researchers, to the cultural impact of live storm coverage. People know what tornadoes look like, they know what they sound like, they know to take warnings seriously. But knowing how to take a warning seriously is not the same as having a place to go when the warning arrives. The next chapter is about a question that haunts every severe weather analysis in the United States. Why do warnings keep getting better? And why do people keep dying? The numbers seem to suggest progress. Average tornado warning lead time in the United States has improved significantly over the past several decades. In the 1970s, lead times were measured in seconds, if any warning came at all. Today, the average lead time is around 13 minutes, with the strongest tornadoes often warned for considerably longer. Doppler radar coverage now blankets the country. Cell broadcast alerts reach almost every phone. Social media spreads warnings within seconds. And yet, people still die in tornadoes, every year. Sometimes by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds. The April outbreak so far had killed at least 3 people that the public knew of, 2 in Runaway Bay, Texas, 1 in Kent County, Michigan. Damage assessments and search operations were still ongoing in multiple communities, and the final number could grow. So if the warnings are better, why does the death toll remain stubborn? The answer involves several factors, none of them simple. The first factor is housing. Mobile homes and manufactured housing remain disproportionately represented in tornado fatalities. According to research compiled by the National Weather Service over multiple decades, residents of mobile homes are far more likely to die in a tornado than residents of permanent structures, even at the same wind speeds. The reason is mechanical. Mobile homes are simply not built to survive tornado force winds. A direct hit by even an F2 can be lethal. The second factor is shelter access. Many parts of the country, including parts of the plains, do not have widespread basements due to soil conditions or building costs. Without an underground shelter, residents have only interior rooms to retreat to. An interior bathroom or closet can save lives in lower-rated tornadoes, but offers limited protection in F4 or F5 strikes. Above-ground safe rooms, which are reinforced shelter structures designed to withstand tornado winds, exist but are relatively expensive to install. Federal grant programs subsidize them in some areas, but coverage is uneven. The third factor is timing. Tornadoes that strike at night are significantly deadlier than tornadoes that strike during the day. The reason is intuitive. People are asleep. They miss the warnings. By the time they hear a siren or feel their house shake, the tornado is already on top of them. Research has consistently shown that nocturnal tornadoes account for an outsized share of deaths. The fourth factor is communication. While cell broadcast technology has improved alert reach dramatically, gaps remain. Cell towers can lose power during severe weather. Some people disable emergency alerts on their phones, often by accident. Older residents may not have smartphones at all and rely on outdoor sirens that are not always audible from inside a closed home. The warning message itself may not always communicate urgency in language that prompts action. The fifth factor is human behaviour. Even when warnings reach people, the response is not always what forecasters hope for. Some people seek visual confirmation of the tornado before sheltering, putting themselves in harm's way. Some have lived through previous warnings that did not produce damage in their immediate area and have developed a kind of warning fatigue. Some simply do not have anywhere safer to go than where they already are. The sixth factor is the storm itself. Some tornadoes give very little warning even with excellent radar coverage. Tornadoes embedded in line storms can form rapidly. Tornadoes wrapped in heavy rain are sometimes invisible until they are very close. Tornadoes forming from the rear flank of a complex storm system can develop in minutes. The radar lead time for these events can be limited even with the best technology. Here is the harder truth underneath all of this. Weather warnings do not save lives directly. They create the opportunity for people to save themselves. The actual life-saving action requires shelter access, communication systems that reach the person, behaviour that translates the warning into protective action, and structures capable of withstanding the wind. Any break in that chain can result in a fatality. The Enid outcome, with 0 deaths despite F4 damage, was a case where every link in the chain held. The warnings reached people. The shelters existed. The residents took the warnings seriously. The tornado missed the most vulnerable structures. The Runaway Bay outcome, with 2 deaths despite a less violent tornado, was a case where the chain broke somewhere. Improving the survival rate is not just a forecasting problem. It is a housing problem, a communication problem, a public education problem, and an infrastructure problem. The April outbreak was, in a quiet way, a test of all of those systems at once. But as the outbreak entered its 6th and 7th days, a larger question began to emerge. How does this outbreak compare to previous years, and what does the broader pattern of 2026 tell us about the season ahead? The next chapter looks at the count. By April 24th, 2026, the United States had recorded 451 confirmed tornadoes for the year. The number came from preliminary data tracked by storm reporting services and confirmed in National Weather Service damage surveys. The figure was already significantly above the long-term average pace for that point in the calendar. To put that in context, the United States averages approximately 1,200 to 1,400 tornadoes per year. In recent decades, the number has fluctuated, with some years exceeding 1,700 tornadoes and others falling well short of 1,000. Reaching 451 by late April means the year is on a trajectory that, if sustained, would place it in the upper range of recent annual totals. The pace is not just about quantity, it is also about timing. Tornadoes in the United States typically peak in late April and May, with secondary peaks in November and a small bump in December for the southeast. The fact that 2026 had already produced multiple major outbreaks by mid-April suggests an active, rather than a quiet year, regardless of what happens in the second half of spring. Here is the breakdown for the year so far, based on tracking data. January and February were relatively quiet. This is normal. Winter months produce some tornado activity in the southeast, but the numbers are typically modest. March was very above average. The month saw 3 major outbreaks. Early March produced fatal tornadoes in southern Michigan, including the Union Lake and Edwardsburg events that killed at least 4 people, including a 12-year-old boy. Mid-March brought a separate outbreak across Illinois, with at least 6 confirmed tornadoes spanning multiple counties. Later in the month, an F2 near Fairview, Oklahoma, killed a mother and daughter along US Highway 60. April has been extremely active. The mid-April outbreak on April 13th and 14th produced multiple strong tornadoes across the Central Plains, including F2 strikes near Hillsdale, Kansas. The April 17th and 18th outbreak produced 80 confirmed tornadoes across a span of 650 miles, with 2 F3s in Wisconsin. And the current outbreak that began on April 23rd has produced, among many others, the Enid F4, the Runaway Bay F2 with Fatalities, the Mineral Wells strike, and the Stone County, Arkansas tornado. That is, in total, an extraordinary spring by any measure. Comparisons to recent years are illuminating. 2024 and 2025 were both extremely active tornado years, with 2024 producing the second highest annual tornado count on modern record. Many forecasters expected 2026 to be calmer, based on the seasonal climate signals discussed earlier. So far, that calmer expectation has not materialized. There is an important caveat to these counts. Tornado totals in the modern era are not strictly comparable to totals from decades past. Detection technology has improved enormously. Doppler radar coverage is more complete. Public reporting through smartphones and social media catches more tornadoes that would have gone unrecorded in earlier eras. Some atmospheric scientists believe that the apparent increase in annual tornado counts over recent decades reflects, in part, better observation rather than truly more tornadoes. That said, the stronger tornadoes, the F3 through F5 strikes, are detected fairly reliably even in older datasets. Their counts have remained relatively stable, with significant year-to-year variability over the past several decades. This suggests that what may be changing is not the total number of tornadoes, but the geography of where they occur and the demographics of who is exposed to them. Here is the larger meaning of the 2026 count so far. The year is shaping up to be active. Whether it ends up among the most violent on record will depend largely on what happens in May and early June, which is climatologically the peak of tornado season. The atmospheric pattern that produced the April outbreaks does not have to continue for the year to remain extreme. The plains are entering their most active climatological window. But the question that remains, and that climate scientists have been investigating with increasing intensity over the past decade, is whether something larger is happening. Whether the patterns that have produced the active recent springs are part of a longer-term shift in the atmosphere itself. The answer is complicated, contested, and important. The next chapter is about the climate signals. A few thousand miles southwest of the United States, in the central Pacific Ocean, the surface temperature of the water has been running cooler than normal for months. This is the condition known as La Niña. It is one of the most studied recurring climate patterns on Earth, and it has a measurable influence on weather across North America. La Niña conditions, broadly speaking, tend to produce a specific atmospheric pattern over the United States during late winter and spring. The jet stream typically takes a southward dip across the southern plains. Storm systems track through that dip more frequently. Gulf moisture flows northward more aggressively, and the conditions that favour severe weather in Tornado Alley tend to be enhanced. This is not a guarantee. La Niña springs can vary widely. Some are very active, some are surprisingly quiet. The relationship between Pacific water temperatures and tornado outbreaks is statistical, not deterministic. A La Niña pattern raises the odds. It does not set the calendar. In the months leading up to 2026, climate scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and other research institutions had been tracking a transitioning La Niña. Pacific waters were cool, but moving toward neutral. Forecast services like WeatherTrack US used this signal as one of several inputs in their seasonal outlooks. Their analog years included 1976, 1985, 2001, 2009, and 2023. In several of those analog years, the spring severe weather pattern was front-loaded. March and early April produced more activity than May. By late spring, the pattern in those years tended to quiet down across many regions. The forecast for 2026 echoed that logic. What is becoming clear as April unfolds is that even within an analog framework, individual years can deviate significantly from the expected pattern. The atmosphere is too complex to be predicted by sea surface temperatures alone. Other patterns matter. The Arctic Oscillation, which describes the pressure pattern over the polar region, can affect how often cold air masses penetrate southward. The Pacific North American pattern, which describes the position of upper air ridges and troughs over North America, can influence where storms track. The Madden-Julian Oscillation, a moving pulse of tropical convection that circles the globe every 30 to 60 days, can locally enhance or suppress severe weather risk for periods of weeks. When all of these patterns are factored in, even the best seasonal forecasts carry significant uncertainty. They describe probabilities. They cannot resolve the timing or intensity of any specific event. There is a separate and more difficult question that scientists have been working on for years. What role, if any, does longer-term climate change play in tornado patterns? The answer is genuinely complex. Tornadoes themselves are extremely difficult to attribute to climate change. The reason is that tornado formation depends on a delicate combination of moisture, instability, and wind shear. A warming climate could plausibly increase moisture and instability, which could favour tornadoes, but it could also weaken the temperature contrast between polar and tropical air, which could reduce wind shear, which could disfavour tornadoes. The net effect is hard to predict from theory alone. What the data has begun to show, with increasing confidence, is a few specific shifts. The geography of tornado activity has been shifting eastward, with Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky seeing more activity than past climatology would suggest. The seasonality of tornadoes has been shifting earlier, with more late winter and early spring activity than in past decades, and the clustering of tornadoes into multi-day outbreaks has been increasing, while the total number of tornado days per year has been decreasing, a pattern sometimes called the tornado frequency paradox. These shifts are visible in the data. They are consistent with what some climate models predict for a warming atmosphere, but the attribution science remains careful. No reputable scientist will claim that any single tornado outbreak, including the April 2026 events, was caused by climate change. The honest position is that the background conditions are changing in ways that are statistically detectable, and individual events are becoming part of a shifting baseline. Here is the larger meaning of the climate signals. The atmosphere over the United States is not a static system. It responds to the temperatures of distant oceans, to the position of the jet stream, to the slow warming of the planet itself. The April outbreak is the kind of event that scientists will study for years to understand exactly which signals contributed to its severity and exactly how typical or unusual it really was. But there is one shift in the data that is harder to explain away with statistical caveats. The places where strong tornadoes are striking most often have been changing, and the new geography is, in some ways, more dangerous than the old one. The next chapter is about why Tornado Alley has been moving east. There is a tension in atmospheric science that listeners should understand directly. On one hand, climate change is real, measurable, and increasingly visible in weather patterns around the world. On the other hand, the connection between climate change and tornadoes specifically is one of the most difficult attribution problems in the entire field. Both of those statements are true at the same time. Honest scientists hold both of them. Here is what the research has been able to establish, and what it has not. What is established? The atmosphere is warming. Average global surface temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree Celsius, or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, since the late 19th century. The lower atmosphere holds more water vapour at higher temperatures by a known physical relationship called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. Roughly 7% more water vapour per degree Celsius of warming. This means that the atmospheric reservoir of moisture, which fuels thunderstorms, has been increasing. What is also established? Sea surface temperatures, including those in the Gulf of Mexico, have been rising. A warmer Gulf means more moisture flux northward into the plains during spring. Some studies have documented earlier seasonal arrival of warm, humid air over the southern United States, consistent with a warming pattern. What is more uncertain, whether these moisture and instability changes translate cleanly into more or stronger tornadoes. The reason is that tornadoes also require strong vertical wind shear, and wind shear is largely driven by the temperature contrast between cold polar air and warm subtropical air. If the polar regions warm faster than the subtropics, that contrast weakens and wind shear could decrease. Some climate models predict exactly that outcome. Other models predict that local shear over Tornado Alley could be maintained or even enhanced by changes in jet stream behaviour. The result is that climate models, when run forward, do not produce a clear consensus on whether tornado frequency or intensity will increase in a warming world. Some studies suggest a small increase. Some suggest little change. Some suggest possible decreases in some regions. The uncertainty is real and acknowledged within the scientific community. What the observational data has begun to show is a slightly different story than the models alone would predict. The clustering of tornadoes into intense multi-day outbreaks appears to have increased over recent decades. The total number of days with tornadoes has decreased somewhat, but the number of days with many tornadoes has increased. In other words, when conditions favour tornadoes, they really favour them. When conditions do not, the atmosphere is increasingly quiet. Some atmospheric scientists have suggested that this clustering pattern is consistent with what a warming climate might produce. If the atmosphere becomes more variable, with longer stretches of quiet interrupted by more intense outbreak periods, the clustering would naturally emerge. But the science here is still being developed. Definitive conclusions are not yet possible. There is also the geographic shift that was mentioned earlier, the eastward drift of tornado activity into the mid-south and southeast. Some researchers have linked this shift to changes in Gulf moisture distribution and changes in the position of the dry line. Others have suggested that changes in jet stream patterns may be redirecting the most severe weather setups into different regions. The honest answer is that the shift is real and observed, but the causes are still being investigated. For the public, the practical takeaway is this: communities in the Mid-South and Southeast can no longer assume that severe tornado activity is something that mostly happens in Oklahoma or Kansas. The geography is changing. And the populations exposed to that changing geography are larger and more vulnerable than the populations of traditional Tornado Alley. There is a final important note. Even without climate change, the United States would still experience violent tornado outbreaks every spring. The geographic and atmospheric setup of the central United States produces these events naturally. What climate change appears to be doing is modulating the underlying patterns making certain configurations more frequent, shifting the timing, moving the geography. Whether it is also making the strongest tornadoes stronger remains an open question. Here is the larger meaning of the climate question. The April 2026 outbreak fits within a pattern of recent active spring severe weather. Whether that pattern is a temporary fluctuation or part of a longer trend is something only sustained observation will reveal. What is certain is that the United States is now in an era where multi-day, multi-state outbreaks are becoming a recognized feature of late April and May, and communities have to plan accordingly. But there is one specific demographic shift that is changing the human toll of these outbreaks regardless of whether the storms themselves change. More people are now living in the path. The next chapter is about the population that has moved into harm's way. A community in central Mississippi has more residents, on average, than a community of the same physical size in central Oklahoma. The same is true comparing rural Alabama to rural Kansas, and rural Tennessee to rural Nebraska. The Mid-South and Southeast are simply more densely populated than the Great Plains. This is the part of the eastward shift in tornado activity that gets less attention than it should. When a tornado moves east, it moves into a more populated landscape. A tornado of identical strength can produce wildly different fatality counts depending on what it hits. A long track F4 through open Kansas farmland might damage a few barns and injure no one. The same F4 through suburban Tennessee can level subdivisions and kill dozens. The enhanced Fujita scale measures wind and damage. It does not measure the human geography of where the storm goes. Population data confirms the imbalance. Rural Mississippi counties typically have several times the population density of comparable rural Oklahoma counties. Manufactured housing rates, the housing type most vulnerable to tornado damage, are higher across much of the Deep South than in the Central Plains. Median household income is generally lower, which correlates with reduced ability to install safe rooms or invest in other shelter infrastructure. Now overlay the geography of recent severe weather. Some of the deadliest tornadoes of the past decade have struck communities in the Mid-South and Southeast. The April 2011 super outbreak killed more than 350 people, with the heaviest tolls in Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. The December 2021 outbreak that produced the Mayfield, Kentucky tornado killed dozens across multiple states. The March 2025 outbreak that hit the Mid-South was similarly costly. The April 2026 outbreak so far has been concentrated in more traditional Plains and Texas locations. Enid, Runaway Bay, Mineral Wells, the Arkansas tornado near Hanover. But the pattern over the past decade has clearly extended the threat zone eastward. Communities in the Tennessee Valley, the Mississippi Valley, and the Tennessee River corridor are now routinely under tornado watches during outbreaks that historically would have stayed farther west. Researchers have documented this shift extensively. Studies published in atmospheric science journals over the past decade have shown statistically significant eastward movement of the most active tornado region. The changes have been visible in both tornado counts and tornado damage data. The trend is robust enough that it has entered standard textbooks on severe weather. Why is the shift happening? The answers are not fully resolved. Some research has suggested changes in moisture distribution, with the Gulf moisture envelope reaching farther east during spring than in past decades. Some has pointed to shifts in dryline behaviour. Some has invoked changes in the jet stream pattern. The climate change connection remains under investigation, but the geographic shift is well documented regardless of cause. There is something darker about the eastward shift that listeners should understand. The southeast has more nighttime tornadoes than the plains. The reason is that storms in the southeast often arrive later in the day, after travelling east through the storm's life cycle. Nighttime tornadoes are deadlier because people are asleep, warning reception is reduced, and visibility for any kind of self-preservation is gone. The southeast also has more tornadoes embedded in heavy rain. These so-called Hoch supercells, or high precipitation supercells, are harder to see visually. Residents who try to confirm a tornado before sheltering may not see the funnel until it is on top of them. Storm chasers operating in the southeast face the same problem from a research perspective. The stunning tornado footage that listeners see most often comes from the dry air supercells of the plains, not the rain-wrapped monsters of the Mid-South. Here is the larger meaning of the eastward shift. The American severe weather problem has been changing geographically in ways that increase its human cost, even if the storms themselves are not necessarily becoming more numerous or stronger. A tornado that strikes denser populations will kill more people regardless of whether the tornado itself is more violent. Public policy, building codes, shelter access programs, and emergency management resources have been slower to follow the shift than the storms have. But for any individual person in any of these regions, the question that matters most is also the most personal. What can I do in the moment to survive a direct hit? The next chapter is about the architecture of survival. The woman in Enid who climbed into her concrete cellar with 3 other people survived an F4 direct hit. The tornado destroyed the home above them. The cellar held. They emerged with their lives, and that outcome was not unique. Across the Grey Ridge neighbourhood, residents who had taken shelter in basements, cellars and reinforced rooms walked out alive while their houses were reduced to debris fields. The architecture of survival in a violent tornado is, in the end, simpler than most people think. It comes down to one principle: get below ground level, or behind the strongest walls available, with as many barriers as possible between you and the wind. Here is what works, ranked roughly by effectiveness. A purpose-built underground storm cellar is the gold standard. Reinforced concrete construction, sealed from above by a heavy door, buried below the frost line in the surrounding earth. A storm cellar is, in physical terms, almost impossible for any tornado to defeat. The earth surrounding it absorbs almost all of the kinetic energy. The only failure modes are flooding, from water trapped in poorly drained installations, and asphyxiation from blocked ventilation in long-duration shelters. Both are rare, and both can be designed against. A basement in a permanent home with a strong interior section away from windows is the next best option. Most well-built American basements survive tornado force winds because they are below grade and protected by the foundation walls. The standard advice is to choose an interior corner of the basement, get under a heavy table or workbench, and cover oneself with a mattress or thick blankets to protect from falling debris. This advice has been refined over decades of post-tornado damage analysis. An above-ground safe room is a reinforced shelter installed within an existing home. Modern safe rooms are typically constructed of steel or thick concrete and are anchored to the home's foundation. Federal Emergency Management Agency standards specify that they must be able to withstand winds equivalent to the strongest tornadoes ever recorded. Federal grants have subsidized installation of these in tornado-prone areas, though coverage remains uneven. An interior bathroom, closet or hallway on the lowest floor of a home is the standard recommendation when no purpose-built shelter is available. The principle is barrier layering. Each interior wall the tornado has to penetrate absorbs some of its energy. By the time wind and debris reach the innermost room, their force is reduced. This works well for lower-rated tornadoes, F0 through F2. It is less reliable for F3 and above, but it is still better than any exterior room. What does not work? Vehicles. Mobile homes. The southwest corner of a basement, which is folklore that has been thoroughly debunked. Highway overpasses, which can actually increase wind speeds due to a Venturi effect and have been the site of numerous fatalities. Open windows, which were once thought to equalize pressure, but are now understood to provide no protection and to introduce flying debris. Outdoors, in any form. Here is the part that most people do not realize. Modern American tornado fatalities are concentrated in a few specific scenarios: mobile home residents who could not reach a permanent shelter, vehicle occupants caught on the road, outdoor workers or recreationalists who missed warnings, permanent home residents who sheltered above ground without basement access during an F3 or higher tornado. The implication is that tornado survival is largely a question of access to the right shelter at the right moment. Awareness of the warning is necessary, but not sufficient. The shelter has to actually exist, has to be reachable in the time available, and has to be one that the resident knows about and trusts. This is where public infrastructure matters. Some plains and Midwestern communities have invested in community storm shelters, public buildings designated as safe gathering points during tornado warnings. Some mobile home parks have built collective shelters for residents. Some schools have hardened their hallways and bathrooms to safe room standards. These investments save lives, sometimes invisibly, by providing options to people who would otherwise have none. Here is the larger meaning of survival architecture. Tornadoes cannot be prevented. They can only be navigated. The communities that consistently survive direct hits with low fatality counts are the ones that have invested in shelter infrastructure, communication systems, and public education. The communities that suffer disproportionate losses are usually the ones where one or more of those elements is missing. Enid, on April 23rd, had all three. The result was 0 deaths despite F4 damage. That outcome is not normal. It is a model. But survival is only the first phase of recovery. The longer phase, the one that lasts months and sometimes years, is rebuilding. The next chapter is about what comes after the cleanup crews leave. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma stood in front of cameras in Enid the day after the tornado and said something that listeners should hear directly, in spirit if not in exact words. This is not going to be a week of recovery, he said. This is going to be months to years of recovery for this community and for all of these families. He was being literal. The visible phase of tornado recovery happens fast. Within 48 hours of the Enid strike, debris removal had begun in the most heavily damaged neighborhoods. Volunteers from across Oklahoma and surrounding states had arrived to help. Convoy of Hope, a faith-based disaster relief organization, had deployed teams by Friday morning. The Red Cross was helping displaced residents find temporary lodging. The Baptist Disaster Relief was setting up shower trailers and meal stations. But the slower phases of recovery extend long after the news cameras leave. Phase 1 is the emergency response. Search and rescue, medical care, immediate shelter for displaced families. This phase lasts hours to days. In Enid, it was largely complete by the morning of April 24th. Phase 2 is the cleanup phase. Removing debris, clearing roads, restoring power, restoring water service. This phase lasts days to weeks. Insurance adjusters arrive. Demolition of unsalvageable structures begins. Initial assessments of how many homes can be repaired versus how many must be rebuilt are made. Phase 3 is the rebuilding phase. This is where the timeline stretches into months and years. New homes have to be designed, permitted, and constructed. Lost belongings have to be replaced. Lost vehicles have to be repurchased. Insurance claims have to be filed, negotiated, and paid. For uninsured or underinsured families, federal disaster assistance has to be applied for, processed, and distributed. Phase 4 is the economic recovery phase. Local businesses that were damaged or destroyed have to decide whether to rebuild or relocate or close permanently. Employees who depended on those businesses face job uncertainty. Tax revenues to local governments fall. Community institutions like churches, schools, and clubs may have lost meeting spaces. The economic ripple can last years. Phase 5 is the psychological recovery phase. Survivors of violent tornadoes often experience long-term mental health effects. Post-traumatic stress, anxiety triggered by storm warnings, sleep disturbances when severe weather is in the forecast. Children who lived through a tornado strike can carry that trauma into adulthood. Mental health resources in small communities are often limited, and the demand after a disaster can overwhelm what is available. The federal disaster declaration process is designed to support all of these phases, but it has limits. Federal Emergency Management Agency individual assistance grants are typically capped at a fixed amount per household. Small Business Administration disaster loans are available, but they are loans, not grants, and they have to be repaid. Federal funds for infrastructure repair flow primarily to public buildings, roads, and utilities, not to private homes. Insurance, where it exists, fills some of the gap, but many homeowners discover after a disaster that their policies have exclusions, deductibles, or coverage limits that leave them with significant out-of-pocket expenses. Renters often have no coverage at all. Mobile home residents frequently find that their pre-storm property values were already low, leaving them with insufficient compensation to rebuild even with full insurance payouts. Governor Kevin Stitt's executive order declaring a disaster emergency for Garfield and Kay counties triggered the state-level recovery process within hours of the Enid strike. The federal process began shortly after. By late April, residents were being directed to a state-operated damage reporting website, damage.oc.gov, where they could log their losses and access information about available assistance programs. Here is the part of recovery that does not get covered in news reports. The communities that successfully recover from violent tornadoes are not necessarily the ones with the most damage or the fewest casualties. They are the ones with strong existing social networks, robust local government, willing volunteers, and patient long-term commitment from outside support organisations. Recovery is not a single event. It is a multi-year process that depends on sustained attention from people who do not live in the affected community. After the cameras leave, after the volunteer crews go home, after the federal funds are distributed, the community keeps rebuilding, quietly, house by house, year by year. But while Enid begins that long process, the atmospheric pattern that created it is not yet finished. The forecast for the next 24 hours, as of the most recent updates, remained active. The next chapter is about what the radar suggests is still coming. By the afternoon of April 28th, the multi-day outbreak had entered its 6th day, and the Storm Prediction Center was already preparing forecasts for the 7th. A level 3 of 5 risk of severe thunderstorms remained in place across much of Arkansas, parts of southern Missouri, northeast Texas, northern Louisiana, and central and northern Mississippi. A tornado watch was in effect for parts of northern Mississippi, southwestern Tennessee, southeastern Arkansas, and extreme northern Louisiana, valid until the early morning hours. The storm system was finally beginning to weaken, but it was not yet finished. Here is what the radar and the forecast models were showing. The original near-stationary cyclone that had driven the outbreak from April 23rd through April 26th had largely weakened. The second cyclone that replaced it was now moving eastward more steadily, pulling the severe weather threat zone deeper into the Mid-South and the Tennessee Valley. The level 3 risk area was narrower than on previous days. The number of expected discrete supercells was lower. The atmospheric ingredients were still present, but they were less explosive than they had been at the height of the outbreak. For communities in the active threat zone, however, less explosive did not mean safe. Damaging winds, large hail, and a few tornadoes were still expected to affect millions of people across a broader zone, from the lower Mississippi Valley to the Tennessee Valley. The same kinds of dangers that had killed people earlier in the outbreak were still present, just at lower probabilities. Emergency managers across the affected region were doing what they always do during the late stages of an extended outbreak: watching radar carefully, coordinating with utility crews still completing restoration from earlier storms, pre-positioning resources for any new damage, updating shelter information for residents whose homes had become uninhabitable during the previous days, and bracing, quietly, for one more night. There is a phenomenon that severe weather researchers have documented in the late stages of long outbreaks. Public attention often declines even as the threat continues. The first major strike produces saturation news coverage. By day 3 or 4, coverage has decreased. By day 6, most national news has moved on to other stories, even if the threat is still active. Local news continues to cover it intensively, but the broader public awareness drops. Residents in the threat zone may be more likely to ignore warnings on later days of an outbreak than on earlier ones, simply because the warnings have become familiar. This is one of the quiet dangers of multi-day events. Warning fatigue is real. Forecasters know it. Emergency managers know it. They work to communicate the persistent threat without crying wolf, but the public's capacity for sustained alertness has limits. For listeners in the threat zone or with family there, the practical advice from the National Weather Service has remained consistent throughout the outbreak. Have multiple ways to receive warnings. Cell broadcast alerts on a phone. A NOAA weather radio. Local television or radio. Text alert services from local emergency management. Do not rely on a single source. Power outages can disable some methods. Cell tower failures can disable others. Have a shelter plan. Know where to go in your own home. Know where to go if you are at work, at school, or in transit. Practice the route mentally so that when an alert comes, you can act without thinking. Take every warning seriously, even on the 6th day of an outbreak. The atmosphere does not care that you were also warned yesterday and the day before. It does not care that you are tired of the alerts. It only cares whether you are sheltered when the funnel arrives. By the morning of April 29th, if the forecasts hold, the multi-day outbreak should finally be ending. The system should move offshore. The remaining showers and storms should be ordinary. The Plains, Texas, and the Mid-South should finally exhale. Damage assessments will continue for weeks. Final tornado counts for the outbreak will not be confirmed until all the survey teams have completed their work. Insurance claims will be filed for months. Federal disaster declarations will be processed for years. And somewhere in Enid, in Runaway Bay, in Mineral Wells, in Hanover, Arkansas, in Kent County, Michigan, families will begin the long process of rebuilding their lives. But the larger pattern of which this outbreak is a part is not over. It is just paused. The next chapter is the final one, and it is about what this 6-day stretch tells us about the new American storm season, and what it suggests about the seasons still ahead. When the final survey teams complete their work on the April 2026 outbreak, the official numbers will be tallied. The total number of confirmed tornadoes, the final fatality count, the estimated property damage figure. Those numbers will be added to the long historical record that meteorologists and climate scientists have been compiling for over a century. By themselves, those numbers will not tell the full story. They never do. What the numbers will show is that a multi-day outbreak in late April produced a violent F4 tornado in Enid, Oklahoma, multiple deadly tornadoes across Texas, more than 300,000 power outages at peak, more than 200 reports of damaging wind and large hail, a particularly dangerous situation watch issued for the Mid-South, confirmed fatalities in at least 3 states, and damage assessments that will continue for weeks. What the numbers will not capture is the larger context. The April 23rd through 28th outbreak was the 3rd major outbreak of April 2026 alone. It followed the April 13th and 14th events and the April 17th and 18th events, both of which were themselves significant by historical standards. By the time the April outbreaks were complete, the United States had recorded one of the most active spring severe weather periods of recent years. This is happening in a year that, according to seasonal forecasts, was expected to be more moderate than the previous 2 springs. It is happening in a year with transitioning La Niña conditions. It is happening in a year whose analogue comparisons suggested a front-loaded season followed by a quieter back half. The lesson is straightforward. Seasonal forecasts describe probabilities. The atmosphere does what the atmosphere does. And the atmosphere has in recent years been doing more. There are several patterns embedded in the recent record that listeners should carry away from this analysis. First, multi-day outbreaks have become a recognised feature of the late April and early May severe weather window. The April 2026 events follow a pattern visible in other recent springs. Long-duration severe weather sequences, lasting 4 to 6 days or more, driven by stalled atmospheric patterns, producing destruction across multiple states. This is not historically unusual, but it has become more visible in recent years. Second, the geographic distribution of severe weather risk has been shifting eastward. The April 2026 outbreak still concentrated in traditional Plains and Texas locations, but the broader pattern over the past decade has clearly extended the threat zone into the mid-south and southeast. Communities in those regions are now routine participants in major outbreaks. Third, warning systems have continued to improve, and they continue to save lives. The Enid outcome, with F4 damage and 0 deaths, is a testament to what coordinated forecasting, public communication, and shelter access can achieve. It is also a reminder that those systems are not equally available to all communities, and that fatalities in other affected areas during the same outbreak reflect gaps in the system. Fourth, the climate signals underneath these events remain genuinely uncertain. The atmosphere is changing in ways that are detectable in the broader data. Whether those changes are increasing the frequency or intensity of tornadoes specifically is still under investigation. Honest scientists are not yet ready to make confident attribution statements about individual outbreaks. They are increasingly comfortable saying that the background conditions in which outbreaks occur are shifting. Fifth, the human and economic costs of severe weather continue to grow, in part because of population shifts, and in part because of the value of property and expanding metropolitan areas. Even outbreaks that historically might have been considered modest can now produce billion-dollar damage totals. The April 2026 events will almost certainly contribute to a substantial damage figure once final assessments are complete. Here is the larger meaning of all of this. The United States has entered a phase of its severe weather history where major outbreaks are not anomalies. They are expected. They are forecast. They are studied. They are warned, and they still produce catastrophe in communities that lack the infrastructure or the timing to fully escape the storms. Communities in the affected regions have responded with growing investment in shelter infrastructure, public education, and emergency management capacity. State and federal disaster systems have improved, forecasting technology has advanced dramatically, insurance markets have adjusted, sometimes to the detriment of homeowners who find coverage harder to obtain or more expensive in tornado-prone areas. What remains constant is the underlying geography. The Gulf of Mexico still pumps moisture northward every spring. The Rocky Mountains still generate dry air to the west. Canadian polar air still pushes south on cold front cycles. The dry line still forms over the plains. The triple point still ignites supercells. The mesocyclones still rotate, the tornadoes still touch down, and the people in their paths still have to survive them. The April 2026 outbreak is over. The next one will come. Whether it arrives in May of this year or in March of next, the same atmospheric machinery will produce it. The names of the affected towns will be different. The damage paths will trace different fields and neighbourhoods. The fatality counts will reflect a different set of human stories. But the underlying pattern will be familiar. For the families in Enid, in Runaway Bay, in Mineral Wells, the story is already personal. Their homes, their neighbourhoods, their sense of what spring means in their part of the country has been changed. For the rest of the United States, the question is whether this outbreak is remembered as a significant event in a long sequence, or whether it becomes the moment when more communities start asking serious questions about preparation, infrastructure, and resilience for the next time the atmosphere stalls and refuses to move. The radar will tell us soon enough, it always does.